Romantic Tales. Chapter 466. Princess Ding is indeed a unique woman. This prince admires you. In a quiet room, the crown prince of the northern tribes, Yelu Hong, looked at Emo Xiaoyao and smiled. Just now, everyone's attention was focused on the arena below, and did not notice that the crown prince of the northern tribes and Prince Ding were watching from a room on the second floor. Emo Xiaoyao snorted, but his cold face had a bit of warmth. Obviously, he was very satisfied with Yelu Hong's compliment. Princess Ronghua sat next to Yelu Hong. She used to be the proud and beautiful princess of the royal family in the capital, but now in the northern tribes she was even more gentle and charming. Princess Ronghua gently leaned against Yelu Hong and poured wine for him from time to time. Her beautiful eyes were slightly narrowed, but there was a bit of bitterness and complexity. Just 2 years ago she hadn't put Ding Wangfei in her eyes at all. But in just 2 years, the gap between her and Princess Ding had become so big that she felt ashamed to even be mentioned in the same breath. Looking at Princess Ding's calm demeanor on the arena and her archery skills that even the best archer of the northern tribes could not match, Princess Ronghua knew that Princess Ding was someone she would never be able to match in her life. The door of the room was gently pushed open from the outside. Yi Li stood at the door with a smile and said, "Crown Prince Yelu, I'm sorry to disturb you." Yelu Hong was startled but quickly smiled and said, "How would I dare? This prince is honored to have princess here. Please come in." Yi Li stepped into the room and walked to Emo Xiaoyao's side. Emo Xiaoyao reached out to help her sit down and said softly, "Just find someone to play with him." Why did Princess Li personally compete with him? Yi Li smiled and said, "I just wanted to see how good the #1 archer of the northern tribes is." Yelu Hong raised his cup and smiled, "I've embarrassed myself in front of Princess." Although Huyen Lu was known as the #1 archer of the northern tribes, that was only a matter of more than 10 years ago. Veherent Huyen Lu. Yelu Hong shook his head and smiled, "Let's not talk about such a disappointing person. Come Prince, please." Yi Li raised her wine cup and said with a faint smile, Crown Princess, please." A few days before Prince Ding's 1-month-old birthday party, the entire Ruyang city was filled with singing and dancing. Behind all this singing and dancing, there were also some agreements that had been reached in secret. For example, trading with Nanzhao and purchasing large amounts of medicinal herbs from Nanzhao every year. Another example would be secretly purchasing large amounts of grain from a grain merchant in Dechu State. Or the temporary agreement with the crown prince of the northern tribes to stabilize the borders was carried out without the knowledge of the public. As a result, compared to the joyous and peaceful people outside, the people inside the Prince Ding mansion were busier than usual. Reporting to Princess Genom of Gojoseon and Crown Prince Genom of Gojoseon request an audience. Yi Li had a rare moment of free time to accompany the baby in her room. The baby, who was almost a month old, was not as sleepy as when he was just born. He opened his round eyes and looked at Yi Li. His dark eyes seemed to be covered with a layer of water, causing Yi Li's heart to soften. She felt that no matter how much she loved this baby, it would not be enough. Hearing Lin Han's report, Yi Li frowned and asked, "Is the prince in the mansion?" Lin Han said, "The prince accompanied young Master Qingchen out of the city this morning and has not returned yet. Would you like to invite Genom of Gojoseon to come back tomorrow?" Everyone in the Prince Ding mansion did not have a good impression of Genom of Gojoseon. Zhuojing, Lin Han and the others were still brooding over the incident of Princess Fei falling off the cliff. Naturally, they did not wish for Yi Li to see Genom of Gojoseon again. Yi Li put down Emo Xiaobao and said with a faint smile, "No need. Right now we are in the Prince Ding mansion. If Ben Fei refuses to see you, it will seem cowardly." Lin Han was silent and retreated to the door to wait for Yi Li to come out. Not long after, Yi Li had already settled Emo Xiaobao down. She led Qing Wan and the others out of the room and towards the front hall. In the main hall of the Prince Ding mansion, Lei Tingfeng sat calmly below Genom of Gojoseon and looked at the furnishings of the main hall. To be fair, the Prince Ding mansion in Ruyang was not as magnificent as the Prince Ding mansion in Chujing. Because it was newly renovated, it did not even have the ancient and gloomy atmosphere of the Ding mansion in Chujing. Instead, it had more of the rough simplicity and freedom of the Northwest. Genom of Gojoseon was also looking at the entire main hall, but his gaze was more focused on the direction of the door. Hearing the tinkling sound of ornaments outside the door, Genom of Gojoseon's eyes became deeper and sharper. Yili stepped into the main hall and laughed loudly. Ben Fei came late and made Prince and Shitzi wait for a long time. Director Imo, why didn't you serve tea to the guests? Lin Han, who was beside Yili, glanced at Genom of Gojoseon and his son, who were sitting empty, and said lightly, replying to Princess, Director Imo went to arrange for people to decorate Mr. Qingyun's new residence. Lei Tingfeng also knew that he and his son were not welcomed in the Prince Ding mansion. He smiled bitterly in his heart and said to Yili, Princess, you don't have to be polite. Yili smiled sweetly and said, etiquette can't be ignored. Recently the mansion has been very busy. Director Imo is inevitably negligent. Shitzi, please forgive me. Lin Han nodded and went to the door to instruct the servant girl who was waiting outside to serve tea. When the tea was served, Yili took a sip of tea before looking at Genom of Gojoseon and said with a smile, my son's 1-month-old banquet is approaching. Today this consort and the prince are both busy. If there is any neglect, please don't blame the prince. Genom of Gojoseon looked deeply at Yili for a long time before moving his eyes away and said with a smile, how could that be? Princess's arrangements are very thorough. I only feel at home. Yili naturally didn't take Genom of Gojoseon's polite words seriously. She didn't ask about the arrangements for the guests at all. Zhuojing and Wei Lin were both vengeful people. They probably wouldn't really make the guests they arranged feel at home. After pausing for a moment, Yili asked, Prince and Shitzi, why have you come? Lei Tingfeng smiled and said, there are some small matters that I would like to discuss with Prince Ding. However, this humble prince has asked to see Prince Ding twice before and has been rejected. I have no choice but to come and disturb Princess. I hope Princess will forgive me. Yili blinked. She thought about how Imo Xiaoyao's face would darken at the mention of Xiling and Genom of Gojoseon. If Lei Tingfeng asked to see him, he might really be rejected. Most of the time Imo Xiaoyao was completely unreasonable when he was willful. However, Yili wasn't displeased at all. She knew that Imo Xiaoyao was so willful and rude to the people of Xiling not only because of the current conflict between the Northwest and Xiling, but also because of her. It was common for countries to fight to the death. After the fight, they would continue to drink at the table as if the friendship between the two countries had a long history. This was because there were no permanent enemies or friends between countries. Instead, it was personal matters that made it easier for people to bear grudges. Looking at Lei Tingfeng with a smile, Yili smiled unapologetically and said, Xiaoyao has been busy these days. Shitzi, please forgive me. Lei Tingfeng naturally couldn't not forgive her. He waited until Yili asked, if Shitzi has anything to say, it's the same to tell me. At this time, Lei Tingfeng glanced at his father who was sitting to the side thinking about something. He smiled and said, actually it's not a big matter. This humble prince accidentally heard that Prince Ding has reached a trade agreement with the Northern Army and Southern Zhao. Yili raised her eyebrows. The word accidentally was used well. Xiling must have placed many spies in each country to be able to have such an accident. She calmly waited for Lei Tingfeng to finish his words. Lei Tingfeng felt somewhat helpless. He really didn't like to talk to Yili. This was because after interacting with Yili a few times, it was difficult to treat her as an ordinary person. No matter when, it was difficult to see any unexpected emotions in her eyes or face. It was as if she was really a gentle and harmless lady from a famous family. One could never see any emotions such as curiosity, surprise, or worry on her face. The pressure such a person gave to the opponent during negotiations was unimaginable because one could never find out her bottom line. Perhaps her bottom line was only a few millimeters away from yours, but it felt like it was thousands of miles away. Chapter 467. It was not the first time Lei Tingfeng had been so depressed. After a moment of disgust, he did not care. He continued, Wang Fei should know that there are many transactions and exchanges between our country, Dongchu and Nanzhao every year. Many of these goods need to pass through the northwest. While Xiling was large, it was a country lacking in material resources. Many things had to be imported from other countries. Of course, Xiling pursued the principle of being strong if you could rob, but there were always some things that could not be robbed. For example, the silk, satin, tea and porcelain that the Emperor of Xiling loved had to be bought from Nanzhao and the Dechu state. These things were not available in the small countries of the west. In the end, the people of Xiling and the people of Dechu state were of the same origin, so most of the people of Xiling were more used to the products of Dechu state. The northwest was the communication stronghold between Dechu state and Xiling. If these things wanted to be transported back to Shilin, they had to pass through the northwest. As for the roads in the southwest, it had been said since ancient times that the Shu road was as difficult as ascending to heaven. It was already very difficult to enter Shu, and they had to travel through mountains and rivers to send the caravans back to Shilin. Not to mention the long detours, the dangers and bandits on the road were enough to make most merchants retreat. Yili smiled. Lei Tingfeng had only said one sentence and she understood the purpose of their visit today. In reality, the Prince Ding mansion had been waiting for their arrival. But Yili had not expected that it was not the people of Shilin who wanted to raise their status to buy time, but Emo Shuyao who had refused to let them in. Gently putting the teacup back on the table, Yili leaned back in her chair and looked at Lei Tingfeng. She asked, I understand Shizi's meaning. Originally, opening up the roads and allowing trade between the two countries is a good thing. But, what benefits does this have to the northwest? In short, why would the Mahist army allow the Shilin caravans to pass through? Lei Tingfeng's eyes darkened slightly. He smiled and said, even during wartime the two countries do not restrict caravans. Mutual exchange has always been a consensus between our country, Dongchu Northern Army and Nanzhao. Wang Fei's words make me puzzled. Yili looked down and smiled faintly. Since that's the case, the West Hill caravan can go through the northwest. Why does the heir have to specifically ask this consort? Lei Tingfeng choked on his bet. When the so-called consensus was implemented, most of the time it was just a piece of waste paper. The trade route was long and eventful. Bandits might appear at any time. Who could say for sure whether it was an accident or not? The original Prime Minister of West Hill was loyal to the previous Emperor of Shilin and was naturally loyal to the current Emperor of Shilin. In the early years he had made trouble for Genom of Gojoseon. However, even though the Emperor of Shilin was not as wise as Genom of Gojoseon, he still knew that the Prime Minister was one of his own. He defended him in court and for many years, Genom of Gojoseon did not have a good time. It was only in recent years that the old Prime Minister who had been through 2 dynasties, was exhausted to death. The subsequent prime ministers were just puppets and could not make any decisions. Now that Genom of Gojoseon said that he would treat Yili with the courtesy of the prime minister, it was naturally very interesting to those who knew the truth. Su Qingchen followed behind Emo Shuyao and entered. When he saw Genom of Gojoseon and Lei Tingfeng, he only raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at Yili with a smile. Yili smiled helplessly and waved for someone to serve tea to Emo Shuyao and Su Qingchen. Lei Tingfeng looked at Su Qingchen for a moment and smiled. Young Master Qingchen, long time no see. You are even more elegant than before. Su Qingchen smiled leisurely as if he did not have the slightest trace of smoke. Your Highness is joking. It hasn't been that long. Didn't we meet in the south last year? Lei Tingfeng's eyes darkened slightly and smiled. This one remembered wrongly. Last year in the south, Su Qingchen had caused him no small amount of trouble. Lei Tingfeng naturally would not underestimate this seemingly free and unrestrained young man who had been crowned as the world's #1 young master by the people of Dechu State. While this side was peaceful, the other side was not so polite. Emo Shuyao casually sat next to Yili and leaned against the back of the chair. He lazily looked at Genom of Gojoseon and asked, Genom of Gojoseon has graced us with your presence. What brings you here? Yili softly explained the purpose of Genom of Gojoseon's visit. Everyone in the hall listened and waited for Emo Shuyao's reply. In the end, Emo Shuyao still had the final say in the Prince Ding mansion in the northwest. If he did not agree, then it would be a waste of time to say anything else. Emo Shuyao's cold face revealed a trace of a cold smile. He looked at Genom of Gojoseon and smiled. Didn't Genom of Gojoseon say that he wanted to compare notes with I? It just so happens that I have some free time today. As long as Genom of Gojoseon defeats I, anything can be discussed. Everyone was stunned. They did not expect that Emo Shuyao would want to fight with Genom of Gojoseon at this time. Lei Tingfeng frowned and said, Prince Ding now? Emo Shuyao interrupted Lei Tingfeng and said with a smile, Don't worry, heir, I will definitely not bully Genom of Gojoseon because he is missing a hand. At worst, I will also fight with Genom of Gojoseon with one hand. Chapter 468. Hearing this, the hall was filled with a chill. Genom of Gojoseon stared darkly at Emo Shuyao and said coldly, Prince Ding is too conceited. Do you think you have the ability to fight with I with one hand? Everyone knew that Genom of Gojoseon's left arm was a taboo. That was also the worst defeat in Genom of Gojoseon's life. Not only was his undefeated record broken, his personal guards were almost completely wiped out before they managed to save him. Even so, he still paid the price of an arm to escape from Emo Liufeng's hands. Now that the person who mocked him was Emo Liufeng's son, it was even more unbearable. Emo Xiuyao didn't care about Genom of Gojoseon's anger, and said casually, "It's still easier than waiting for Genom of Gojoseon to grow a new arm, right?" Impudent. Genom of Gojoseon was furious. His right hand slammed heavily on the armrest and he leapt into the air, sending a palm strike towards Emo Xiuyao. Emo Xiuyao snorted, and with a wave of his sleeves he grabbed Yili with one hand and dodged Genom of Gojoseon's attack. When Genom of Gojoseon and the others chased after them, Emo Xiuyao had already landed on the ground with Yili in his arms. He even had the time to comb her hair that was blown by the wind. Then he turned to face Genom of Gojoseon and took 2 steps forward, saying indifferently, "Please." Genom of Gojoseon snorted coldly and flew towards Emo Xiuyao. Emo Xiuyao didn't avoid him either, and the two of them began to fight in the courtyard outside the hall. This action naturally attracted the attention of many people in the Prince Ding mansion. Everyone who heard the news stared at the fight between Genom of Gojoseon and Lei Tingfeng, who was watching from the side. Feng Jiao was even more anxious to see the world in chaos. He stood beside Yili and said with a grin, "Wang Fei, has our prince's martial arts improved yet again? Prince Ding has single-handedly challenged the #1 master of West Hill. Once this news spreads, I don't know how many people will bow down to the name of our prince." The people present were all people with sharp ears and eyes, so they naturally heard Feng Jiao's words clearly. When he looked again, Prince Ding had indeed only used one hand when he was fighting with Genom of Gojoseon. His other hand was behind his back and did not move at all. Genom of Gojoseon naturally heard this as well. His expression became even more gloomy and his moves became even more fierce. Even though it seemed fair to use one hand to fight with the other, there were not that many fools in this world. Genom of Gojoseon had been crippled for more than 10 years, so he was already used to using one hand. Prince Ding, on the other hand, had always used 2 hands. Now that he was using only one hand, his combat power was definitely not as good as before. In this way, Genom of Gojoseon would look bad if he lost, but it would also be dishonorable if he won. Even though the Prince Ding mansion had strict rules, the people who had free time were still quite relaxed. For example, at this moment, the people who had nothing to do to watch the fight between their prince and Genom of Gojoseon had already started to bet on who would win and who would lose. However, the results of the bets were somewhat distorted. They were all betting that their prince would win. In this way, if they lost they would not have to pay, but if they won they would not have to pay, so the bets could not be opened. Feng Jiao smiled from ear to ear as he approached Lei Tingfeng and said, "Prince Lei, do you want to place a bet? Do you think our prince will win or your family's king of axes?" Lei Tingfeng glanced at him indifferently. Naturally, he would not answer such a question. Feng Jiao did not mind his indifference. He turned and asked Yili, "Princess consort, what do you think?" Yili was focused on the fight in front of her, and did not have the mind to pay attention to Feng Jiao's words. Speaking of which, this was the first time she had seen the real fight between the world's top 4 masters. The others were also watching seriously. After all, such a fight was not common. For those who practiced martial arts, watching such a battle between experts was also very beneficial to their own martial arts cultivation. The only person present who was not interested was Su Qingchen. Even though young Master Qingchen was a genius, he did not know anything about martial arts. With his cultivation and knowledge, he naturally had no interest in watching the spectacle. Looking at the mesmerized crowd in the courtyard, young Master Qingchen could only helplessly leave quietly and return to his study to deal with his own matters. This fight lasted for nearly 4 hours, and the original bet quickly spread from the Prince Ding mansion to the entire Ryong city. Han Mingxi, who had heard the news, rushed over to be the banker. He had people continuously broadcast the results of the fight to the outside world, and at the same time set a new betting record. The citizens of Ryong City naturally supported their prince without any hesitation. However, those who supported Genom of Gojoseon did not say anything. Although the number of people who supported Prince Ding was not as many as those who placed their bets on him, the number of people who placed their bets was not a problem. Therefore, for a moment the two of them appeared to be evenly matched. In the courtyard of the Prince Ding mansion, the 2 figures exchanged blows at lightning speed. Their speed was so fast that it was almost impossible to see their moves clearly. After the two palms met again, the two of them retreated a few steps back. Genom of Gojosian's expression was hidden. His originally gorgeous sleeves had been shredded by the fierce wind from the palms, making them look ragged. Emo Shuyao lowered his eyes slightly. His face was slightly pale and a strand of snow-white hair fell in front of his face. It was obvious that it had been cut off by the wind from the palms. Genom of Gojosian laughed coldly and said, Emo Shuyao, do you really think that you can use I with one hand? Emo Shuyao raised his head and smiled faintly. Why don't you try and see if I can cut off your other hand as well? Impudent brat. Genom of Gojosian angrily rebuked. He waved his palm and the force of his palm surged towards Emo Shuyao with the force of a landslide. Emo Shuyao's body turned and like a spiral he leapt up and turned in the air at a strange angle, directly aiming for Genom of Gojosian's right arm. Father, be careful. Lei Tingfeng cried out in alarm. Genom of Gojosian snorted coldly. His palms did not stop and he quickly sent out a few palms to stop Emo Shuyao's attack. The two of them once again fought back and forth. Yili did not see the end of this competition. As she watched the sun set in the west, Yili got up and returned to her room to take care of her precious son. In any case, in the Prince Ding mansion, even if Emo Shuyao could not win against Genom of Gojosian would definitely not be able to hurt him. When she returned to her room, Emo Xiaobao was indeed fine. He was crying loudly in his wet nurse's arms. Because Yili did not like wet nurses to take care of children, Emo Xiaobao did not like to be carried by wet nurses other than when he was drinking milk. Even the two madams of the Su family were more liked by Emo Xiaobao than wet nurses. When Yili returned to her room, the two wet nurses were being tormented by Emo Xiaobao until they were covered in sweat. She walked over and took him into her arms. Emo Xiaobao's large eyes looked at his mother. He sniffled and rubbed his little nose in Yili's arms before falling asleep. Yili looked at the little bun in her arms with interest. She did not know if such a small thing could recognize people, but it was clear that the little baby could recognize her and Emo Shuyao. This proved that no matter how much Emo Xiaobao cried as long as he was in her arms, he would definitely not cry again. Similarly, no matter how happy he was as long as he was awake, he would definitely cry until the sky turned dark in Emo Shuyao's hands. Yili could not help but wonder where this 1-month-old little guy got so much strength and tears. Just as she was coaxing Emo Xiaobao to sleep, the servant outside reported that first Madame Su, second Madame Su, and young Miss Qin had arrived. Yili hurriedly had someone invite the three of them in. Eldest aunt, second aunt, older sister Jing, why are you here? Why are you here? Yili carried Xiaobao out and asked with a smile. Chapter 469. Su Defuren smiled. I heard that there was a fight in the front yard? Although the Su family was not pedantic, but women generally did not go to the front yard, especially now that Qin Jing was preparing for marriage and the two Su Furens also had to prepare for the wedding. Yili smiled and said, Aunt, you don't have to worry. His Royal Highness and Shilin Zhenanwang are just playing around. Even as women, they had heard of Genom of Gojosian's reputation. How could they not be worried? So they sat in the parlor and chatted with Yili while waiting for news. Only when the sky was completely dark did Qing Wan run back and smile, reporting to Wang Fei, the fight in the front yard is over. Yili raised her eyebrows and smiled. Who won? Qing Wan grabbed the end of her braid and said with some confusion, It seems that no one won and no one lost, it was a draw. But in the end Genom of Gojosian spat out blood, probably Genom of Gojosian lost? Neither lost nor won? Then clearly won. If it was a draw then the house would win. Qing Wan covered her mouth and smiled. Maybe when I came back just now, I saw young Master Han smiling very happily. Prince said that after sending off Genom of Gojosian and Shitzi, he would come back to have dinner with Wang Fei. Yili nodded and smiled. Let the kitchen prepare a few dishes that Prince likes. Qing Wan smiled and left. Knowing that there was nothing else, the two Su Furens and Qin Jing also got up and left. After a while Emo Shuyao had already returned. Seeing Yili holding Emo Xiaobao who refused to sleep in one hand and holding a book in the other to pass the time, he frowned unhappily. Hearing the footsteps, Yili quickly put down the book and smiled. You're back? Are you hurt? Emo Shuyao snorted softly. He picked up the swaddling blanket that was wrapped in little treasure Emo and walked towards the bed. Yili was shocked. It was scary enough for a 1-month-old baby to be carried in swaddling clothes. Seeing Emo Xiaoyao put the baby back into the cradle, Yili let out a sigh of relief. Emo Xiaobao didn't cry and even looked at her with his big round eyes. She was just about to ask Emo Xiaoyao about Emo Xiaobao's safety when the baby she gave birth to would be tortured to death by his own father. Before Yili could say anything, Emo Xiaoyao let out a muffled groan and sat down on the bed. A trace of blood flowed from the corner of his lips. Yili was shocked and frightened. How could she still remember to blame Emo Xiaoyao as a father? She hurriedly got up and asked someone to call Shinyong over. Emo Xiaoyao reached out to grab her and shook his head. Yili frowned and looked at him for a while. Other than his face being a bit pale, there was nothing wrong with him. Only then did she relax a bit. She wiped the blood from the corner of his lips and asked, "Why didn't you say that you had internal injuries? Didn't you say that it was a draw and Genom of Gojosian vomited blood?" Emo Xiaoyao smiled faintly. Lei Jinting is one of the top 4 masters in the world. How can there be no price to pay when fighting with him? Yili looked at him unhappily and said, "So, Genom of Gojosian vomited blood in front of others, but Prince came back and vomited blood behind others' backs?" Emo Xiaoyao snorted and looked at Yili without refuting. Of course he couldn't tell Yili that Lei Jinting didn't intend to vomit blood, but he was angered by him in the end. So Lei Jinting didn't vomit blood because he was injured, but because he was angered. Emo Xiaoyao couldn't help but frown when he thought of Lei Jinting's last palm strike. The #1 master of the West, Hill was indeed worthy of his reputation. If they were to compare moves to his full strength, he might be able to beat Lei Jinting because of his uninjured hands. But if they were to compare internal energy, he seemed to be slightly inferior. But it didn't matter. He wasn't even 30 years old, but Lei Jinting was already close to 50 years old. If he could still beat Lei Jinting in terms of ability, then Lei Jinting's title as the #1 master of the West Hill wouldn't be so genuine. Even if they didn't use their internal energy, he could still kill him. Whenever he thought of the way that old man looked at Yili, Emo Xiaoyao couldn't control the murderous intent in his eyes. Emo Xiaoyao suddenly felt that his last words to Lei Jinting were too tactful. That old and ugly man's face didn't even deserve to look at Yili. Thinking of something, Emo Xiaoyao thoughtfully raised his hand to touch the mask on his face. Yili looked strangely at the man who was sitting by the bed in a daze. She raised her hand to touch his forehead and asked, "What's wrong? Are your injuries too serious?" "It's nothing." Emo Xiaoyao smiled and said, "I'm just thinking about tomorrow's banquet. I don't know if Lei Jinting will be able to attend." Yili sat down beside him and said with a smile, "What's there to think about? The so-called banquet is just a formality. The truly important matters were dealt with before and after the banquet. The full moon banquet was just a show for ordinary people. As for whether Genom of Gojosian could attend, Emo Xiaoyao wouldn't be so reckless as to beat Genom of Gojosian until he couldn't get out of bed, right?" On this day, Ruyang City was once again in an uproar. Although most people didn't see the duel between Genom of Gojosian and Prince Ding, there wasn't a single person in Ruyang City who didn't know about it. So much so that after the duel ended, no matter which side they supported, they all hung their heads in dejection and secretly felt sorry for their wallets. Only the banker Han Mingxi's extraordinarily handsome face smiled more and more seductively. Who told Prince Ding to personally admit that he had tied with Genom of Gojosian. No one won. In the end, the winner was naturally Han Mingxi. Located not far from the Prince Ding mansion, the Han estate was Han Mingxi's residence in Ruyang City. At this time, Han Mingyue was facing a table full of banknotes, silver ingots, jade, jewelry, and so on with a smile. Feng Jiao sat to the side and cast a sidelong glance at the overjoyed Han Mingyue and snorted in displeasure. Han Mingxi raised his head and glanced at him. He got up and walked to his side, sat down and said with a smile, "Young Master Feng-san, how come you have time to come to my humble home?" Feng Jiao glanced at the things on the table that he hadn't had time to put away and asked, "How much did you earn?" Han Mingxi raised his eyebrows and proudly gestured a number. Feng Jiao was immediately envious and jealous. He fiercely glared at Han Mingxi. 50,000 taels? That included his own 800 taels. Han Mingxi contemptuously glanced at him and said with a smile, "Young Master Feng-san, aren't you looking down on Prince Ding and Genom of Gojosian too much? What is 50,000 taels? 500,000 taels." Feng Jiao was immediately stunned. His original envy and jealousy immediately turned into deep hatred. He looked at Han Mingxi as if he was looking at a tall mountain of gold. More importantly, that mountain of gold belonged to someone else. No wonder so many people in this world liked to open casinos. It was simply a matter of small capital and huge profits. No, Han Mingxi didn't even need the capital. It was simply a matter of no capital and huge profits. Han Mingxi sighed with some regret. It's a pity that Prince Ding and Genom of Gojoseon both agreed to have a duel in private. If there was a duel or something, it would have been announced to the entire Dechu state or Xiling 2 months in advance. Not to mention 500,000 taels, he might even have gotten 5 million taels. Losing such a huge opportunity to make money made Han Mingxi's heart ache. Perhaps the members of the Han family were born with a talent for making money. Over the past year, Han Mingxi felt that he could gradually understand his elder brother's personality when he was dying for money. Feng Jiao glared at him with dissatisfaction for a long time before saying casually, "Prince wants you to give him the money as soon as possible." Hearing this, Han Mingxi was furious. He stared at Feng Jiao with a vigilant expression and said, "Why should I? This is the money I earned myself." Feng Jiao sneered, "Don't be silly. If Prince hadn't admitted to a draw in front of everyone in the end, do you think you could have won? Prince said that he would only take half of your money." Seeing how Genom of Gojoseon vomited blood on the spot, if Prince insisted that he had won, no one would have been able to object. When this matter was brought up, Han Mingxi's anger subsided. He asked curiously, "What did Prince Ding say to Genom of Gojoseon in the end?" Although his martial arts weren't very good, he still had some knowledge. Originally, Genom of Gojoseon hadn't been injured much after the last palm strike. At least he hadn't vomited blood on the spot. After Prince Ding said something to Genom of Gojoseon's ear, he saw a mouthful of blood spurt out from Genom of Gojoseon's mouth. It was clearly because he was angry. Why would he use his own money to entertain those idiots that he didn't like? He waved his hand and said, "Go transfer the money directly to Zhou Yu. Isn't he in charge of all these things? If there's any money left, just treat it as a red packet to the people in the city." Feng Jiao silently admired him in his heart. "Prince, not only did you beat up Genom of Gojoseon to vent your anger, but you also earned back the money needed to host the little crown prince's 1-month-old birthday party. How could you use the leftover money to buy people's hearts? Compared to you, Han Mingxi's ability to earn money was simply trash." The entire Ryong city was in an uproar for nearly half a month. Prince Ding's 1-month-old birthday party was finally held as scheduled. In fact, the so-called banquets, whether it was a 1-month-old birthday party, a wedding party, or even a coronation party, were all the same. The only difference was the size of the party. The banquet this time was the same as the previous one. It was still held on the tower in the east of Ryong City. When Emo Shuyao held Yi Li's hand and walked up to the main seat on the tower, everyone couldn't help but be stunned on the spot. Emo Shuyao, who always wore a silver half-mask, finally took off the mask that had accompanied him for nearly 10 years. However, what was exposed in front of everyone's eyes was not the hideous scars and face that they had originally expected. Under the candlelight, silvery white hair casually draped behind his back. Only a silver ribbon casually tied up the hair. Under the cover of a few strands of silver hair was Emo Xiaoyao's handsome and upright face. The people sitting below couldn't even see a small wound, let alone a hideous scar. What was displayed in front of everyone was clearly a somewhat pale but absolutely handsome man. At this moment, the handsome man present was naturally not good. However, only the white-clothed young Master Qingchen, Su Qingchen, could be compared with the unreachable white-haired man who was dressed in a dark purple noble robe on the high platform. However, young Master Qingchen's expression was indifferent. His white robe made him look like a celestial being who had descended, as clear as a lotus and as quiet as the moon. However, the white-haired man was like the sharpest sword, the most noble and gorgeous jewel, the coldest and most icy snow at the peak of a mountain. Even his smile seemed to carry a frightening chill and pressure. As expected of Prince Ding. With such elegance, who else in the world but Princess Ding is a match for him? Even though her heart was tied to Su Qingchen, Princess Anxi couldn't help but sigh as she looked at Emo Xiaoyao. Hearing this, Emo Xiaoyao raised his head and looked at Yi Li, who was standing side by side with Emo Xiaoyao. He smiled faintly, his eyes filled with gratification. When Lear had been betrothed to Emo Xiaoyao, the Su family had felt guilty. If Li Er's marriage to Prince Ding was due to King Li's abandonment, The Su family had at least half of it. Now that they saw Prince Ding standing side by side with Leah, the Su family was naturally overjoyed. Princess Anshi's words are reasonable. I've long heard that King Ding's consort is outstanding. She truly lives up to her reputation. On the other side, the crown prince of the northern tribes, Yelu Hong, added. He raised his head and looked at Yi Yuli with admiration. Yi Li was naturally a beautiful woman, but her appearance couldn't be considered devastatingly beautiful. What was truly attractive was the aura and expression she exuded. Standing beside Mo Shuyao, even the most beautiful woman in the world would be reduced to a foil. However, Yi Li wouldn't. She stood calmly beside Mo Shuyao, a gentle and elegant smile on her lips. Her beautiful and tranquil face, coupled with her distant and calm eyes, was like a peerless peony quietly blooming. Who said that peonies had to be grand and magnificent? She was beautiful, dignified, and natural. She was clearly the king of flowers. Greetings to Prince Ding and Princess Ding. Everyone please rise. Mo Shuyao held Yi Li's hand and said with a smile, Thank you for not being willing to travel thousands of miles to attend my son's 1-month-old celebration. I and the princess consort hope that tonight, the guests and hosts will be courteous and not return until everyone is drunk. Prince Ding, since tonight is the little heir's 1-month-old celebration, would we have the honor of seeing the little heir? Someone immediately asked. Although they all knew that the little heir's 1-month-old celebration was just a cover, since they were already here, they couldn't possibly not see the little heir's appearance, right? Mo Shuyao smiled faintly. What's so difficult about that? The wet nurse carefully carried the infant onto the stage. Yi Li smiled as she took the child. Looking down, Yi Li saw that even though it was late, Mo Xiaobao still hadn't slept. His round and watery eyes looked at Yi Li. It was unknown if he could really recognize Yi Li or if he was familiar with her scent, but once he was in Yi Li's arms he immediately giggled. Yi Li lifted him up slightly so that the people below could see Mo Xiaobao's appearance. The little guy wasn't afraid of strangers and obediently laid in Yi Li's arms, looking at the people below with his large eyes. He didn't care at all that he couldn't see the people and things below. The little crown prince is really talented and full of spirit. Everyone praised him. Yelu Yi, who was seated below, laughed loudly and said, Prince Ding, I wonder if the little heir has received his name. Chapter 471. Mo Shuyao smiled faintly and said, Naturally. Mr. Qingyun personally bestowed the name to my son. Yu Chen. Mo Yu Chen. In fact, many of the people present had already learned of Mo Xiaobao's name through various channels. But when it came from Mo Xuyao's mouth, it was a completely different concept. Nanzhao and Dechu states' culture and customs were completely different. They didn't feel much about it, only praising the good name. The northern tribes were barbarians beyond the Great Wall. Even if they learned from the Central Plains, it was still limited. The ones who were truly shocked were Genom of Gojoseon of Xiling and Mo Jingli of Dechu State. Yu Chen, such a name did not hide Mo Xuyao's expectations for this child or his own ambition. Mo Jingli looked up at Mo Xuyao, who was leisurely holding Yi Li and sitting on the high main seat. His heart surged. He had never understood what kind of mentality he had towards Mo Xuyao, but at this moment he clearly understood how jealous he was of Mo Xuyao. Yes, it was jealousy. Even if they were on the same side, he didn't dare to openly give his child such a name. Therefore, Mo Xuyao's son was called Mo Yu Chen, while his son could only be ranked in the royal family and be called Mo Yunxiao. Even if they were on the same team as Mo Jingqi, Mo Xuyao could openly invite the dignitaries of various countries, just like a king. But he could only secretly contact the dignitaries of various countries. In the eyes of the dignitaries of various countries, Prince Ding and Prince Li were never on the same level. Needless to say, the beautiful and elegant woman in Mo Xuyao's arms should have been his wife. However, even if his heart was filled with jealousy, he could only sit quietly below and watch Mo Xuyao's glory and pride. Sitting beside Mo Jingli, Ying naturally saw Mo Jingli's expression. A mocking smile appeared on her lips. She looked up at Yi Li, but her eyes were filled with bitterness. In the past, she had felt incomparably proud that she had pulled Yi Li into the Li Palace. Occasionally, she would even feel a trace of sympathy for her half-sister who had joined the Prince Ding mansion. But now they were both princesses. One of them sat above millions of people, controlled the huge Mahist army and the Prince Ding mansion. and had all the love and sincerity of the most excellent husband. She had been imprisoned in the capital with a sick and weak child. Now that she had finally escaped, her husband had many wives and concubines by his side. She had almost lost her place. Who was the one who needed sympathy? Mo Yuchen? Good name. Jinnan King's gaze lingered on the child in Yi Li's arms for a moment before he praised. Mo Shuyao was not polite and calmly replied, "It is a good name." Yellow Yi stood up and smiled. "Prince Ding's Shitzi is 1 month old. I specially brought a gift from the northern tribes for Shitzi. I hope Prince Ding will not dislike it." Mo Shuyao looked down at Yellow Yi and smiled faintly. "Seventh Prince has come from afar. How can I be so rude? I thank Seventh Prince on behalf of my son." Yellow Yi smiled and raised his hand to blow a strange whistle in the air. With a whistling sound in the air, a black shadow rushed down from the air and headed straight for where Mo Shuyao and Yi Li were sitting. The people below the stage could not help but exclaim. When the black shadow appeared under the light of the fire, it could be seen that it was not black but a large snow-white bird. It spread its wings and a pair of sharp claws flashed under the light of the fire as it rushed towards the 3 people on the stage. In the midst of the crowd's exclamations, the large white bird seemed to have hit something and stopped a few feet away from the 2 people. Then it continued to charge forward. But there was clearly nothing in front of it, as if there was an invisible wall in front of it. At this time the crowd could see that it was actually a large white eagle. The white eagle was blocked by an invisible barrier and could not get close to Yi Li and Mo Shuyao. But it did not want to leave and instead desperately charged forward and cried out. Yi Li slightly frowned and reached out to cover Mo Xiaobao's ears. She coldly stared at the white eagle and said, "Shut up." The coldness was so strong that even the proud white eagle could not help but tremble. Then it cried out even louder. Mo Shuyao sneered. "Impudent." With a flick of his wide sleeves, even the valiant eagle was caught by him and thrown out. The direction it was thrown just happened to be where Yellow Yi was sitting. Seeing the white eagle being thrown without any resistance, Yellow Yi could only get up and quickly retreat a few steps. The white eagle just happened to land on Yellow Yi's empty chair. The dizzy white eagle couldn't tell the difference between a person and a person. As soon as it got up, it charged towards Yellow Yi. Yellow Yi was shocked. This white eagle was the most ferocious bird in the northern militant grassland. Even wolves were afraid of it. If one was scratched by its claws, even if they did not die, they would lose half their life. Yellow Yi hurriedly blew his whistle in an attempt to control the white eagle, but the white eagle had just been thrown to the ground by Mo Shuyao and was seeing stars. When it heard the whistle, it habitually rushed forward. Yellow Yi had no choice but to use his qinggong to retreat to the side. Thus everyone watched as Yellow Yi was chased around by the white eagle they sent over. They could only look at each other, not knowing whether to laugh or pretend they did not see anything. Mo Shuyao squinted his eyes to enjoy the farce in front of him. Yi Li held Mo Xiaobao and also indifferently looked at the little fellow who was occasionally reaching out to tease him. Mo Shuyao's roll and toss just now was not that simple. Yi Li was sitting beside him and clearly saw Mo Shuyao sprinkle some strange medicinal powder on the white eagle's body. Although she did not know what it was, she could make a guess based on the white eagle's behavior. The best part was that the white eagle was flying around. Even if they caught it later, they might not be able to find any medicinal powder on its body. More importantly, the white eagle was sent over by the northern militant people. Even if there was anything, it was their own business. Seeing Yellow Yi being chased around by the dizzy white eagle, Yi Li faintly smiled. "All right, come and take down the 7th prince's gift." "Yes, princess." 2 shadow guards stepped out from the crowd and attacked the white eagle from the left and right. If the white eagle was flying in the air, they naturally would not be able to catch it. But the white eagle's body was heavy and could not fly. After a few rounds, the 2 worked together to capture the white eagle and lock it in a sturdy cage sent over by the people below. Only then did everyone let out a sigh of relief. Yellow Yi made such a big joke in front of the nobles of the various countries. Seeing the white eagle that was angrily banging against the cage and trying to escape being taken away, Yellow Yi's face darkened to a frightening degree. Everyone looked at his sorry state and whispered to each other. The people from the Prince Ding mansion had to restrain themselves out of respect for the host. The envoys from the other countries were not so reserved. A few people from Xiling were even convulsing with laughter. This made Yellow Yi's mood even more gloomy. Yi Li handed Mo Xiaobao over to the nanny beside her and said with a smile, It was just a small accident, don't mind it. Prince Yelu, why don't you go change your clothes? Chapter 472. Yelu Hong nodded and said, Princess is right. Seventh brother accidentally disturbed the prince. Princess, please forgive him. Seventh brother, go quickly. Yelu Hong and Yelu Yi had always been at odds with each other in the northern tribes. It was an understatement to say that they wanted to kill each other. But now that they were in the Dechu state, they had no intention of fighting each other. Yelu Hong only gave a faint reminder. Yelu Ye's expression was ugly as he cupped his hands towards Yi Li and Mo Xiuyao. He turned and left to change his clothes. The little episode just now did not affect everyone's mood. It was still Yelu Hong who stood up and smiled. Since seventh younger brother is the first to present a gift, this prince represents the northern tribes and imperial father to prepare a gift for the little heir. I hope that Prince Ding and Princess Consort will not dislike it. Yelu Hong waved his hand and two men from the northern tribes came forward with a brocade box. Once the box was opened, a golden light lit up the entire banquet and dazzled the eyes of all the guests. There was also an eagle in the brocade box, but it was different from the white eagle that was charging around. This was a golden eagle. It was almost the same size as the white eagle and was cast from gold. It was lifelike. Even the eyes of the golden eagle were inlaid with two green gemstones. Just by looking at the weight of the two men from the northern tribes, one could tell that this was definitely not a gold-plated object. It was a golden eagle cast from real gold. Even though there were many gold mines in the northern tribes, this gift from the northern tribes was definitely worth it. Mo Xiuyao nodded and smiled. Thank you, Crown Prince of the northern tribes, for your generous gift. With a wave of his hand, someone immediately came forward to take the box. Yelu Hong did not mind and smiled faintly as he returned to his seat. Afterwards, the envoys from various countries presented their own gifts. The generals of the Prince Ding mansion did not dare to fall behind and each presented a gift for the crown prince. Mo Xiuyao didn't have too many thoughts. Even when the king of Zhenan sent him 4 beauties of West Hill, Mo Xiuyao accepted them all without blinking. Everyone looked at Prince Ding and Princess Ding with a strange expression. Yi Li took a sip of the wine and laughed softly. Prince's luck with women is quite good. Mo Xiuyao snorted and laughed. To be able to marry Miss Li as my wife, I naturally have good luck with women. Yi Li raised her eyebrows slightly. Then what does Prince plan to do with those 10 beauties of West Hill? Mo Xiuyao said indifferently, after receiving so many gifts tonight, we can't not return the favor, right? As for Yelu Yi, Yelu Hong, Mo Jingli and Anxi, Princess Anxi was out of the question. Why not just send a few of them? Do you think they can refuse Ai's gift in return? Even if they didn't want it, they could only deal with it privately. They absolutely couldn't embarrass him in public. Hearing this, Yi Li's lips couldn't help but twitch. Mingxi and Feng San are right. Prince is becoming more and more stingy. Not only did he bet on his son's 1-month-old birthday party, he even had to pay for the gifts given by others. Mo Xiuyao laughed. Miss Li, you can't blame me for being stingy. Who asked us to have so many people in the Mahist army to eat and drink? Also, 2 days ago I saw a set of beautiful jewelry from the western regions. It suits Miss Li very well. It cost me a total of 60,000 taels of silver. For me. Hearing the price tag of 60,000 taels of silver, Yi Li frowned slightly. That was 60,000 taels of silver, not 60,000 yuan. But hearing that Mo Xiuyao gave it to her, she was still somewhat happy. There was no woman who didn't like a gift from her husband. Mo Xiuyao nodded and complained, these people really don't know anything. What does a brat like Miss Li know? It's Miss Li who has to work hard to give birth, okay? If they want to give a gift, they should give it to Miss Li. Everyone in the hall looked strangely at the harmonious couple on the main seat. Prince Ding had accepted 10 beauties from West Hill in front of so many people, but Princess Ding didn't seem unhappy at all. She even looked happier than before. What was going on? It didn't look like she was pretending to be happy. Before anyone could say anything, a sharp voice suddenly came from below the city tower. The imperial edict has arrived. Everyone was stunned. Most people couldn't react to what was going on. Where did the imperial edict come from in the middle of the night? The city gates should have been closed by now, right? Also, the Emperor of Dechu State was very strange. He didn't even show up before the celebration for Prince Ding. Now the banquet was halfway through before he came out to scare people. Many people turned to look at Mo Jingli, only to see that Mo Jingli was also frowning with a confused expression. Clearly he didn't understand what was going on either. Yi Li and Mo Shuyao looked calm and uncomfortable. Mo Shuyao's smile deepened. He casually glanced at Su Hongyu and Su Qingchen sitting below the stage. Su Hongyu nodded imperceptibly while Su Qingchen smiled faintly. Not long after, the people who came to deliver the edict had walked up the city tower. The person in the lead was wearing a second-rank court robe. He was the Minister of Rights. The people behind him were also officials from the Ministry of Rights. There were also a few imperial bodyguards following behind. They looked solemn and serious. The Minister of Rights held the imperial edict with both hands and raised it above his head. He said loudly, "The imperial edict has arrived." Mo Shuyao received the imperial edict. Everyone was in an uproar. They weren't here to celebrate Prince Ding's 1-month-old birthday. They were clearly here to cause trouble. Mo Jingli led Yi Li and the others to kneel and receive the imperial edict. Although he didn't like his older brother the emperor, he was still Prince Li of Dechu State. He still had to act on the surface. As for the others, they weren't so polite. The generals and officials of the Mahist army pretended not to hear. They continued drinking and chatting. The so-called imperial edict in the northwest was worse than a piece of paper. As for the envoys from the western hill and northern tribes, they looked like they were watching a show. Mo Xiaoyao, who was sitting on the main seat, clearly didn't have any intention of rising to receive the imperial edict. As a result, only Mo Jingli and the others were kneeling. Mo Jingli was secretly angry. He couldn't help but curse his brother the emperor for being so meddlesome. Clearly, the Minister of Rights didn't expect this situation. He looked at Mo Shuyao, who was leaning lazily on the high platform and looking down at him. The Minister of Rights said in a low voice, "Mo Shuyao received the imperial edict." "Read it," Mo Shuyao said lightly. The Minister of Rights frowned. He was about to speak when Mo Shuyao sat up and stared at him. "Either read the thing in your hand or take it and get out of Ryong City. I am in a good mood tonight. I don't want your worthless lives." Impudent. The Minister of Rights was so angry that his face turned red. He pointed at Mo Shuyao and couldn't say anything for a while. Mo Shuyao had already been stripped of his title by the emperor, but he still dared to be so arrogant. He clearly didn't care about the court or the emperor. "Your Highness Prince Li." The Minister of Rights wasn't an idiot. He naturally knew that he didn't have the ability to go against Mo Shuyao. He could only look at Mo Jingli, who was kneeling on the side. Mo Jingli's face was gloomy. He felt that he had lost all face because of this emperor brother. He stood up and looked coldly at the Minister of Rights. "Didn't you hear? Do you really want to be thrown out without reading the imperial edict?" The Minister of Rights' face twisted a few times. In the end, he swallowed his anger. After all, the emperor had sent him here to pass on this imperial edict. If he was thrown out without reading it, then he definitely wouldn't have a good time when he returned to the capital. Taking a deep breath, the Minister of Rights unfolded the bright yellow silk and read aloud, "By the will of the heavens the emperor decrees. Mo Shuyao, a commoner, is impudent and presumptuous. He has raised an army for his own sake and has conferred himself the title of prince. He has rebelled against his superiors. Yunzhou's Su family has colluded with rebels and conspired to overthrow the country. Mo Shuyao has stripped them of their imperial surname and demoted them to lowly commoners. Yunzhou's Su family is to be executed by the emperor." Chapter 473. The entire city gate tower was silent. Even the voices of the peddlers on the street not far from the city gate tower could be heard clearly. Everyone couldn't help but look at the Ministry of Rights official holding the imperial decree like they were looking at a madman. What was the use of that? Was Mo Shuyao someone that you could demote as you wished? Even if Mo Jingqi wrote 1,000 imperial decrees to throw Mo Shuyao into the dust, he would still be high up in the northwest and look down on the nobles. Was the Su family someone that you could execute just because you wanted to? Why don't you execute a member of the Su family first? Just by looking at the Su family sitting in the front row, it was clear how unreliable the Dechu state emperor's imperial decree was. Mo Jingqi obviously knew that this imperial decree was useless. Therefore he didn't really send people to execute the Su family today, nor did he really want to do anything to Mo Shuyao. He just wanted Mo Shuyao to lose face in front of the heroes and nobles of the world. Haha. A burst of clear laughter suddenly came from the main seat. Mo Shuyao leaned back in his chair as if he had heard something very funny. He laughed so hard that his entire body fell back into the chair. When he finally finished laughing, Mo Shuyao leaned against Yi Li's shoulder and sat up. He looked down at the Ministry of Rights official who was forcing himself to be calm and raised his eyebrows. Take his imperial surname? Did that idiot Mo Jingqi forget that I didn't have his surname? I just happened to have the same ancestor as him. Impudent. You dare to be so disrespectful to the emperor. Although the Ministry of Rights official was angry, his face was also a bit embarrassed. The Dechu state was founded on filial piety. Other than being bestowed the imperial surname due to great contributions, no one could change it, including the emperor. Even if someone really committed the crime of having their entire family executed, they couldn't casually change the criminal's surname. Moreover, Mo Shuyao's surname was originally Mo, and it wasn't a surname bestowed upon him by the emperor. In addition, although the two families came from the same source, after the founding of Taizu, they established their own ancestral temples. Mo Shuyao and Mo Jingqi had the same surname, but they could no longer be considered to have the same ancestors. Mo Jingqi had the power to expel many of the prince's relatives from the clan, but that did not extend to Mo Shuyao. However, no matter how awkward it was, he could not tolerate Mo Shuyao calling the emperor an idiot in front of everyone. Mo Shuyao faintly raised his eyebrows, completely ignoring the furious Minister of Rights. Those who were sent by Mo Jingqi to the northwest to die were obviously not important characters. He was most likely the newly appointed Minister of Rights. Mo Shuyao did not bicker with him, but the generals of the Mahist army could not tolerate it. They all opened their mouths and cursed angrily. The men who came out of the military camp naturally did not have the elegance of the scholars in the imperial court who scolded people. They dared to use all kinds of vulgarities. Mo Jingqi had probably never been scolded this much in his entire life. Mo Shuyao leisurely enjoyed the curses of the soldiers and did not have any intention of restraining them. After all, Mo Xiaobao's 1-month birthday banquet was over. The rest of the banquet was time for entertainment. Below, Lei Tingfeng sat next to Genom of Gojoseon and furrowed his brows. In a low voice he asked, Fuang, what do you think Prince Ding means by this? If word of Mo Jingqi's ruckus spread out, Mo Xuyao's face would not look good. If Mo Xuyao wanted to stop this matter, those officials would not be able to enter. Now, looking at Mo Xuyao's appearance, not only did he not intend to stop it, he even seemed to be adding fuel to the fire. This made Lei Tingfeng somewhat unable to understand what Mo Shuyao wanted to do. Genom of Gojoseon slightly narrowed his eyes and glanced at Mo Shuyao, who was sitting on the main seat with a smile on his face but a hint of coldness in his eyes. His gaze then landed on Yi Li. Yi Li quietly sat next to Mo Shuyao. Her gaze was indifferent as she watched the farce in front of her, as if she did not have any intention of getting angry. Genom of Gojoseon naturally knew that Yi Li was not a woman without a temper. In reality, it was just that she rarely lost her temper. Once she was truly angry, not to mention women, most men in this world would not be able to bear it. The Su family seated below also seemed to be rather calm. Even the third and fifth young masters of the Su family, who had the worst tempers, sat quietly and drank wine, as if this matter had nothing to do with them. After a moment of silence, Genom of Gojoseon's heart skipped a beat. In a low voice he said, I'm afraid Mo Shuyao and the Dechu state will truly fall out. This was not good news for West Hill. West Hill and even the northern tribes in southern Zhao had been sparing no effort in trying to drive a wedge between the Dechu state's royal family and the Prince Ding mansion. But they definitely did not wish for the two to truly fall out. If the Prince Ding mansion and the Mahist army were said to be an extremely sharp sword, then the Dechu state was a somewhat rusty sheath. But when necessary, it could restrain the actions of the Prince Ding mansion and the Mahist army. It could allow the people who were forced into a corner by the sharpness of this sword to have room to breathe and a chance to counterattack. Just like when Mo Shuyao led the army to conquer the south. If not for the imperial court restraining him, the Nanzhao kingdom would have been destroyed in name, even if it had not been destroyed. And once the Mahist army truly broke away from the control of the Dechu state, it would be like an unsheathed sword. When it wanted to swing somewhere, it would inevitably bring destruction and bloodshed, and no one could stop it. Lei Tingfeng was startled. As the Crown Prince of West Hills Genom of Gojosian, he could naturally understand the crux of the matter. But he did not understand why Mo Shuyao chose this time to break off relations with the Dechu state. Previously, when the Mahist army struggled on the battlefield and was stabbed in the back by Mo Jingqi, Mo Shuyao did not do anything. After Yili fell off the cliff, although Mo Shuyao killed 7,000 soldiers and occupied the northwest, he did not really do anything. Even when Mo Jingqi stripped him of his throne, he did not care. But today, looking at the situation in front of him, Lei Tingfeng understood that Mo Shuyao did not intend to continue enduring. Was it because of the Su family? He looked at the calm members of the Su family sitting across from him. From the white-haired Master Qingyun to the oldest fifth young master of the Su family, each of them had an extraordinary aura. But if it was said that Mo Shuyao officially broke off relations with Mo Jingqi because of them, it would not make sense. After all, the Su family had been in the northwest for many days. Genom of Gojosian laughed coldly and said lightly, Mo Shuyao is right. Mo Jingqi is really an idiot. He fell into Mo Shuyao's trap. Mo Shuyao was waiting for him to make the first move. With the pride of the Mahist army, it would be strange if they did not make trouble after being humiliated by Mo Jingqi. Amidst the shouting and cursing, Mo Shuyao calmly raised his hand. The shouting and cursing of the Mahist army immediately quieted down. Everyone looked at Mo Shuyao, who slowly stood up from his seat, and Yili, who stood up with him. The two of them stood side by side high up in the air, making everyone feel as if they were looking up to them. Mo Shuyao smiled coldly as he looked at the Minister of Rites, whose face was green with anger. Then his gaze swept over Mo Jingli. Mo Jingli's heart suddenly tightened. He stared closely at Mo Shuyao. The hands behind his back also secretly clenched. Mo Shuyao, what are you trying to do? Mo Shuyao said, I know what Mo Jingqi wants to say. Since everyone is here today, I also have some things to say. After you hear it, I will bring it back to Mo Jingqi without missing a single word. Chapter 474. Behind him, Zhuojing held a roll of bright yellow silk and walked over. Mo Shuyao casually took it and looked at it. Without even opening it, he casually threw it down and said, Feng San, read it. Feng San, who was originally still drinking with Zhang Qilan, jumped up from the ground. His beautiful red clothes flipped in the air, and like a red cloud he landed in the center of the hall. In his hand he was holding the bright yellow silk. Mo Jingqi is muddle-headed and tyrannical, framing loyal people. As an emperor, he does not care about the stability of the country. First, he colluded with the enemy country to plot against the late Prince Ding Mo Xuan, causing the late emperor to die at the border. Tens of thousands of innocent Mahist army died. Then he colluded with the enemy country to kill the Mahist army, and the Chu state's imperial family and the Mahist army have a grudge against each other for killing their father and brothers, and then for framing and slandering them. The Mahist army has been loyal to the Chu state for generations. Today they have suffered such humiliation and hatred, causing their ancestors to be ashamed and their souls to be unable to rest in peace. Now, with Feihong Pass as the boundary, the Mahist army and the Chu state will be separated. All ties will be severed. Feng Jiao read out his own words on the silk, which seemed to contain internal energy. Not to mention the originally quiet city gate tower, even the noisy streets in the distance instantly became quiet. Feng Jiao's clear and heavy voice immediately rang through half of Riyang City. The Chu state's imperial family killed my father and brothers and humiliated me as a hero. I and the Chu state's imperial family will sever all ties and have nothing to do with each other. Finally, Mo Xuyao's voice reverberated throughout the entire Riyang City. On the city gate tower, the Mahist army soldiers stood up and praised the prince's brilliance. On the side, Mo Jingli's expression was complicated. The Minister of Rites, whose face was originally ashen, was now pale and on the verge of collapse. Mo Xuyao's resolute voice made it clear that the Mahist army that had protected Chu state for over 100 years would no longer have any connection with Chu state. Although the northwest of Chu state had the Mahist army as a barrier to stop the West Hill, the black figure that had never retreated for 100 years could no longer be seen at the border between Nanzhao and the northern tribes. The Mahist army had protected the Chu state for 100 years, but it had finally come to an end tonight. No one could say anything, not even Mo Jingli or Chu state's officials. The entire tower was silent. Everyone looked up at the young man and woman who were standing side by side on the main seat. Everyone thought the same thing in their hearts. This chaotic world is really coming. After that, the banquet was the usual music and dance. However, no one present paid any attention to the enchanting dancers or the moving music. Almost as soon as Emo Xiaoyao and Yi Li left, all the guests left with them. It was important to go back and discuss this matter. At this time, no one was in the mood to enjoy the wine and dance. The next morning, the announcement made by Prince Ding on the city gate tower the night before was quickly sent out by various people in all directions through various channels. But while they were shocked, the envoys of Xiling northern tribes, Nanzhao, and Dechu state did not leave the next morning. In the Prince Ding mansion, the meeting hall was filled with people early in the morning. Many of them had dark circles under their eyes. It was clear that they had not slept well. Emo Xiaoyao and Yi Li walked into the hall side by side. Everyone hurriedly stood and bowed. Greetings to the Prince Wang Fei. The two sat down. Emo Xiaoyao smiled faintly and said, "No need for formalities. Everyone sit as you please. General Zhang and Feng San, what happened? Did you not sleep well last night?" Feng Jiao rolled his eyes. Last night, the envoys of the four countries and the common people were not the only ones who had been frightened by their prince. The one who had received the real surprise was him, Feng San. The prince had not given him any notice beforehand. When he received the silk and opened it, if he did not have great willpower, he almost threw the thing in his hand out. He barely managed to calmly read the words on it. No one knew that Feng Jiao's hands were still trembling when he returned to his seat. Feng San felt that he had been deeply hurt. Emo Xiaoyao looked with a smile at his subordinates who all had different expressions. He smiled and said, "What? Are you all frightened? Are you afraid? The prince should have done this long ago. What do we have to be afraid of?" Lu Jingxian said in a clear voice. The others all agreed. In an instant, the hall was filled with noise and excitement. "Prince, since you've decided to break off relations with the Dechu state, the misunderstanding that the people of the Northwest and even the Dechu state have towards the prince and the Prince Ding mansion can be resolved," Su Hongyu said mildly. Emo Xiaoyao nodded. "What do you think, teacher?" Su Hongyu said, "Strike first to gain the initiative. Clearly announce the grudge between the royal family of the Dechu state and the Prince Ding mansion to the world. Although most of the people are illiterate, they are not unreasonable." Feng Jiao agreed. "What Mr. Hongyu said is extremely true. If we announce it to the world now, by the time the news reaches the Chu capital last night, the whole world will know about Emo Jingqi. This young master wants to see how he will turn the tide." Everyone agreed with Su Hongyu's words. Back then, when Emo Jingqi tried his best to smear the Prince Ding mansion's reputation, the Prince Ding mansion did not refute him at all. They had been waiting for this day. The more the people hated and misunderstood the Prince Ding mansion, the angrier they would be when they learned the truth. Of course, this anger was directed at Emo Jingqi. Emo Xiaoyao and Yi Li naturally didn't have any objections. Emo Xiaoyao looked at Su Hongyu and said, "We'll have to trouble Mr. Hongyu for this." Su Hongyu was a great scholar whose name was known throughout the world. Leaving this matter to him was naturally twice the result with half the effort. Su Hongyu nodded in agreement. He dismissed the high-ranking officials who had entered the mansion early in the morning, leaving behind only a few of his trusted subordinates and the governor of Ruyang City, Zhou Yu. Although Zhou Yu was still young, although he was not outstanding in handling the government affairs, he still followed the rules and did not make any mistakes. Considering his age and experience, it was already excellent. Furthermore, his strict and serious conduct made Emo Xiaoyao and Yi Li very satisfied. "Lord Zhou, have the envoys of Xiling and the northern tribes bid farewell today?" Yi Li asked. Zhou Yu stood up and said respectfully, "Princess, currently, we have not received any letters of farewell from the envoys. However, this morning, Genom of Gojoseon of Xiling, the seventh prince of the northern tribes, and Prince Li of Dechu state all left the city early in the morning, saying that they wanted to enjoy the scenery of the northwest." Yi Li smiled and said, "Let them go. The envoys of the various countries are guests. We must make them feel at home. I hope that Lord Zhou will take care of this. If there are any problems, just send someone to the mansion to report. Of course, if there are people who do not abide by the rules and want to cause trouble in the northwest, Lord Zhou need not be polite. The 2,500 Black Cloud cavalry stationed outside the city will be at your disposal at any time." Speaking of the organization of the Black Cloud cavalry, Yi Li couldn't help but frown. She was used to numbers in the past. This variety of army names made her dizzy. The Black Cloud Cavalry had about 50,000 people. They were divided into the Eagle, Lion, and Tiger armies. Each army had about 16 to 17,000 people. Each army was divided into 5 divisions, each division about 3,000 people. The ones stationed near Ryong were the Eagle Army. Zhou Yu's expression changed. With his age and experience, he had never thought that he would be so trusted by the prince and princess. He hurriedly said, "Prince and princess, please do not worry. This subordinate will not betray the prince and princess's trust." Mo Shuyao clearly saw his thoughts. He nodded and said, "I do not like to use people based on experience and age. Earlier you were able to support the people of Ryong City. I and Princess have entrusted Ryong City to you. You only need to worry about the formalities." Zhou Yu suppressed the surging emotions in his heart and respectfully said, "This subordinate accepts the order. This subordinate will leave." Seeing Zhou Yu turn and leave, Su Qingchen smiled and said, "Prince has managed his subordinates well. No wonder the Mahist army is so united." Mo Shuyao smiled and said, "Young Master Qingchen is too polite. I's subordinates are all rough people. To be honest, I don't have many civil officials. At the time I had no choice but to bring up Zhou Yu. Fortunately he is diligent and strict. He is not bad. In the future I will have to trouble young Master Qingchen and the two sirs." Su Qingchen raised an eyebrow. His smile was light and calm. "Prince trusts the Su family?" Mo Shuyao raised an eyebrow and said, "If he doesn't trust one, why is he doing this? Also, if even the Su family doesn't trust one, who else can? You can't expect I to do everything personally, right? These people in the Mahist army, it's not a problem to have them lead troops to fight, but to have them handle government affairs is more difficult than taking their lives." Chapter 475. On the side, Lu Jingxian nodded in agreement. When they had just taken over the northwest, a large number of officials had been replaced. These generals had also been in charge of local affairs for a period of time. Those days were simply unbearable to look back on. On the side, Lu Jingxian nodded in agreement. When they had just taken over the northwest, a large number of officials had been replaced. These generals had also been in charge of local affairs for a period of time. Those days were simply unbearable to look back on. After chatting and laughing for a while, everyone's expression became serious and they began to talk about serious matters. Su Hongyu asked, "Now that the Northwest has really drawn a clear line with the Dechu state, what does the prince plan to do first?" Mo Shuyao respectfully said, "Please guide me, teacher." Su Hongyu shook his head. "Prince doesn't need to be so polite. I'm sure the prince knows what to do. There's no need for this old man to guide you. This old man's opinion is that the first thing to do is to reunify the positions of the officials, as well as the prince's real position in the northwest for the Mahist army." Mo Shuyao was silent for a moment, then said, "Reunifying the positions of the officials is imperative. But I don't understand the so-called position of the Mahist army and the northwest that teacher spoke of." Su Hongyu looked at him and said, "Now the northwest and the Dechu state no longer have anything to do with each other. So how does the prince plan for the future of the northwest and the Mahist army? Will each occupy a region and peacefully maintain the status quo? Or will you open up new territory and unify the world?" Su Hongyu said the words "unify the world" very softly, but in everyone's ears, it was as loud as thunder. Perhaps it wasn't appropriate to say this when they had just broken away from the Dechu state, but it was also the most realistic problem. The Mahist army had divided the northwest and was surrounded by enemies. If Mo Shuyao didn't have the ambition to open up new territory, then the northwest would one day have to choose a powerful country to rely on. If that was the case, it would be the same as walking down the same path as the Prince Ding mansion or even worse than before. As such, the Mahist army could only move forward and not retreat. Moving forward, expanding the territory and unifying the world. This was the aspiration of the previous kings and generals of the Mahist army. However, due to the restraints of the royal family for many years, they always failed at the last minute. But at the same time, if Mo Shuyao were to establish himself as emperor, no matter how many reasons he had, he would definitely be labeled as a traitor in the eyes of the world. The Prince Ding mansion had a grudge with the current emperor and the previous emperor for killing his father and brother. Why would they say anything when they broke off relations with the Dechu state? However, if they were to destroy the Dechu state, then they would inevitably be branded as traitors. Su Hongyu calmly looked at Emo Xiuyao. This young Prince Ding had experienced countless hardships, but at the same time he also carried the glory and reputation of the Ding King's residence for nearly 100 years. Could he bear this kind of infamy and consequences? Emo Xiuyao suddenly let out a low laugh, looking at Su Hongyu with calm and determined eyes. Emo Xiuyao calmly smiled and said, Mr. Hongyu, there is no need to test I. Since I can break off relations with the Dechu state, why should I not give up such a trivial reputation? The grudge of killing my father and brother, I will definitely get it back from Emo Xiuyao. Su Hongyu was silent for a moment, then stood and cupped his hands to Emo Xiuyao. Prince, please give your orders. Emo Xiuyao was silent for a moment, then opened his mouth and said, change Riyang City to Li City, and set the era name forever. Everyone was startled. Feng Jiao reminded, Prince, the country name. Emo Xiuyao glanced at him and raised his brows with a smile. Who said I want to set the country name? Everyone was silent. What did it mean to change the era name but not the country name? Su Qingchen, who was sitting on the side and listening, raised his head and asked, Prince, you mean to temporarily not ascend the throne? Emo Xiuyao carelessly waved his hand and said, the Northwest is just a small piece of land. Calling myself an emperor is just for my own amusement. Why should I do this for the so-called title of emperor? Under I's rule, if I say I am the king, then I am the king. If I say I am the emperor, then I am the emperor. Everyone understood. This era name was just to distinguish it from the Dechu state's era. Without an emperor there would naturally be no country name. Seeing that everyone was still hesitant, Emo Xiuyao smiled and said, even if I want to establish a country, I can't be so shabby, right? The coronation ceremony was not cheap. Where is the imperial palace? Where is the imperial city? In such a small piece of land like the Northwest, I can't afford to hold a coronation ceremony. Everyone just make do and save some money. Could it be that he wanted to learn from those idiots who dreamed of becoming emperors and casually occupy a small city to establish a country? If he couldn't unify the world, how could he, Emo Xiuyao, have the nerve to call himself an emperor? Su Hongyu sighed softly and nodded. It is good that the prince has such ambitions. Let's do as the prince says. Su Hongyu sighed softly and nodded. It is good that the prince has such ambitions. Let's do as the prince says. The day after Prince Ding's full moon banquet, a shocking thunderbolt was thrown from the Prince Ding mansion. With Ruyang City as the base, Prince Ding officially announced that he controlled 5 states and 17 cities to the west of Feihong Pass in the northwest. Ruyang City was changed to Glass City and the era name was changed to Yongding. From then on, the northwest to the west of Feihong Pass was officially separated from the Dechu state. In the guest house, Genom of Gojoseon was also startled when he heard the news from his subordinate. Glass City. Emo Xiuyao has really made up his mind to not care about the Dechu state? Lei Tingfeng, who had just hurried back, put down his teacup and disdainfully pursed his lips. If I were Emo Xiuyao, it would be good enough if he didn't immediately send troops to kill his way into the Chu capital. Lei Tingfeng was both confused and disdainful of Emo Jingqi's self-destruction. Genom of Gojoseon glanced at his son and smiled faintly. You look down on Emo Jingqi. Do you think that if you were him you would do better than him? Lei Tingfeng frowned. He knew that his father wouldn't ask such an obvious question for no reason. Genom of Gojoseon also didn't really want his answer. He sighed softly and smiled. With subordinates like the Ding King residents, it isn't easy for any emperor. Emo Jingqi himself is a person with lofty ambitions, but he also knows that his abilities are mediocre. It would be strange if he didn't go crazy. Lei Tingfeng frowned. Emo Jingqi, as the emperor, is framing the Mahist army for his own selfishness still, right? Genom of Gojoseon smiled and shook his head. It's fine if you say it's right, but it's also not wrong if you say it's wrong. In Emo Jingqi's eyes, the Ding King residence is much more terrifying than the northern tribes in Xiling. If we want to invade the Dechu state, we will have to go through years of bitter battles. Right now, other than Nanzhao, the 3 countries are actually not that far apart in strength. But the Prince Ding mansion is different. Take Emo Lufeng for example. With his prestige, as long as he revealed the slightest intention of becoming the emperor, do you believe that countless people would immediately rush forward to worship him as the emperor? This kind of person can take over the entire Dechu state without shedding a drop of blood. Do you think that he or the northern tribes in Xiling are more terrifying? But Lei Tingfeng wanted to refute. Genom of Gojoseon interrupted his words. Do you want to say that Mo Lufeng and the Prince Ding mansion don't have the ambition to rule the world? Lei Tingfeng hesitated for a moment before nodding. Genom of Gojoseon smiled. If you are Mo Jingqi, do you really believe that the Prince Ding mansion won't pose a threat to you? Lei Tingfeng furrowed his brows in deep thought. He completely put himself in Mo Jingqi's shoes. After thinking for a long time, he raised his head, but his face was already ashen and his forehead was covered in sweat. Genom of Gojoseon smiled in understanding. Do you understand now? The Prince Ding mansion's fault isn't that they are ambitious, but that they are too powerful. No emperor can tolerate such an existence. How can they tolerate others sleeping beside their bed? If the emperor himself is strong enough, he can still carefully maintain the balance and even suppress them. It's a pity. The royal family of the Dechu state is getting weaker with each generation, while Mo Lanyun's descendants are getting stronger with each generation. This is probably fate. Chapter 476. Lei Tingfeng bowed his head and said, "Thank you, Father, for your guidance. This child's thinking was too simple." Genom of Gojoseon sighed softly and said, "You are still young." Even so, he still felt some regret. Tingfeng and Mo Shuyao were about the same age, but in terms of ability and influence he was far inferior to Mo Shuyao. It wasn't that his son wasn't outstanding enough, but that Mo Shuyao was too outstanding. Father, Mo Shuyao's actions. Lei Tingfeng frowned and said, Mo Shuyao doesn't seem to have any intention of ascending the throne. Genom of Gojoseon nodded and said, if he had intended to ascend the throne, we wouldn't have come to Prince Ding's 1-month birthday banquet, but directly to the coronation ceremony. This is where Mo Shuyao is smart. Just watch, after the news from Ruyang City spreads, the entire Dechu state will immediately lean toward the Prince Ding mansion. But if Mo Shuyao were to ascend the throne at this time, it would be very different. In many things, going too far is as bad as not going far enough. This also shows that Mo Shuyao is not only outstanding in ability but also has enough patience. In this world, not everyone can withstand the temptation of the throne. Lei Tingfeng was silent. In the history books, there were countless people who claimed to be kings after occupying a small piece of land. Later generations would only find it comical and laughable. But if one was really among them, how many people could withstand the doubts of the throne? Lei Tingfeng knew in his heart that at least he couldn't. Should we take this opportunity to send troops? Genom of Gojoseon raised his hand and said, send orders back to the border of Xiling. The entire army is to retreat 30 li. Lei Tingfeng didn't understand. Father. Genom of Gojoseon said in a low voice, let's negotiate with Mo Shuyao. Lei Tingfeng frowned. Mo Shuyao's actions will definitely infuriate Mo Jingqi. Once Mo Jingqi sends his troops to the northwest, we will take advantage of the situation to invade. Why would father want to negotiate with Mo Shuyao? Genom of Gojoseon sneered disdainfully. Do you think Mo Shuyao really dares to touch Mo Shuyao? If he had the guts, he wouldn't have waited until today. So what if Mo Shuyao didn't have that era name before? It was a fact that the Mahist army had occupied the northwest. Mo Jingqi had no lack of reason to send troops to suppress them, but did he dare to? At most, Mo Shuyao would only send a few troops for show. For the time being, Mo Shuyao wouldn't bother with him. When the time comes, the Mahist army will turn around and target us. Lei Tingfeng said, our West Hill isn't afraid of the Mahist army. Genom of Gojoseon smiled. That's right. We aren't afraid of the Mahist army. No matter how powerful the Mahist army is, they won't be able to wipe out the West Hill with just the strength of the Northwest. But if the northern tribes and the southern tribes interfere, will you be afraid? None of them were easy to deal with. They weren't the only ones who knew how to loot a burning house. Lei Tingfeng was silent. The news of the Mahist army breaking off relations with the Dechu state spread like the wind throughout the entire Dechu state and the surrounding countries. The impact was so great that Mo Jingqi didn't expect it. Not only were the people who felt cheated dissatisfied with the court, but even the prince, who had given orders to various regions, began to feel restless. Not to mention the increasing mobilization of troops in the surrounding countries. Not to mention the northern tribes, even some of the small tribes in the north began to provoke them at the border. Perhaps the officials in the Chu capital were still angrily cursing, But the people at the borders of the Dechu state had personally experienced what losing the Mahist army meant to the Dechu state. Emoshuyao. What a Emoshuyao. What a Prince Ding mansion. One day I will execute your entire family. In the imperial study, Emo Jingqi crazily smashed the furnishings in the room. This time he was completely helpless against Emo Shuyao. Emo Shuyao had thrown such a huge bomb at his son's 1-month birthday banquet. By the time the news reached the Chu capital, it would have spread throughout the world. Not to mention that Emo Jingqi wanted to refute or counterattack. There would be countless scholars who would collectively submit memorials to the court every day. Those memorials were more like questions than memorials. However, the evidence given by the Northwest was conclusive, and there were no flaws in the reasoning. No matter how he argued, it would be useless. Every day when Emo Jingqi saw the memorials, he couldn't help but have a headache. In the anger of being cheated by the ruler and the worry of losing the Mahist army, these scholars and people almost forgot the righteousness of the Prince Ding Mansion's declaration of independence from the Dechu state. Come, pass on Jin's decree. Immediately mobilize an army of 500,000 to suppress the traitor Emo Shuyao. Emo Jingqi, who had lost his head in anger, roared loudly. Right now he didn't want to think about anything. He only wanted to kill the Mahist army and kill everyone in the Prince Ding Mansion. Only then would he be able to vent the hatred in his heart. Prime Minister Liu, who was standing in the corner, looked at Emo Jingqi's crazy appearance and frowned. He hesitated for a moment and advised, Your Majesty, the northern tribes are eyeing the border covetously. The border between the southwest and West Hill is not peaceful either. Prince Ding. Before he could finish, Emo Jingqi interrupted him. It's the traitor Emo Shuyao. Prime Minister Liu nodded and said, Emo Shuyao sent 200,000 Mahist army to guard Feihong Pass. We want to. I'm afraid it won't be that easy. Emperor, please reconsider. There were at least 400,000 Mahist army in the northwest. Although the military strength of the Dechu state was several times that of the Mahist army, there were only a few who could really compete with the Mahist army. If they wanted to conquer the northwest, the Dechu state had to be prepared to gamble with the whole country. But no matter how they looked at it, it was obviously not worth it. How could Emo Jingqi not know this? It was because he understood this that he was even angrier. Get out! Get out! Emo Jingqi roared angrily. He grabbed something on the table and threw it over. Prime Minister Liu was old. Although the flying inkstone didn't hit him, he was still shocked. Taking a look at Emo Jingqi, who was supporting himself on the table with an angry face, Prime Minister Liu's eyes darkened. He quickly stepped out. In the Prince Ding mansion, Yili took the letter from Zhuojing and raised her eyebrows. The letter was sent by Tan Jiji. Naturally, it was to remind Yili that it was time to release Xu Manlin, who had been imprisoned by them for a long time. Although Xin Yang and Dr. Lin had verified that the Biluo flower they brought back from the Chu capital was real, Yili still didn't care about Xu Manlin and didn't release her before the medicine was developed. Zhuojing asked, Princess, should we reply? Yili folded the letter with a smile and put it back. She said with a smile, Tell Tan Jiji that it's not that I don't want to release her, but that Princess Anqi of Nanzhao is now a guest in Li City. If she knows that the Saint of Nanjiang is here, it won't be good. Tell him to wait a few more days. As soon as Princess Anqi leaves the northwest, I will release her immediately. Tell him to rest assured that we haven't mistreated Xu Manlin in the past few months. Zhuojing nodded. He thought for a while and asked, These days various forces have been secretly running around in the northwest. Even the prince's mansion can't stay still. Should we release the news about the Imperial Jade Seal? Yili nodded in agreement and said with a smile, Otherwise, why would I see Tan Jiji in the northwest? Let's spread the news about Tan Jiji's identity and the whereabouts of the Imperial Jade Seal. Also, he came to the northwest to get the Imperial Jade Seal and the treasure. Since he released the news himself, let him enjoy it now. Zhuojing said with a smile, Princess is wise. As long as he thought of Tan Jiji being chased by various forces, Zhuojing couldn't help but be in a good mood. It was easy to feel happy when others were unlucky. Chapter 477. Okay, there's one more thing. Yanwang Chamber of Commerce's sickly scholar has appeared in the northwest. He entered the city early this morning and is staying at an inn in the city. After he finished talking about Tan Jiji, Zhuojing changed the topic and talked about another matter. Sickly scholar was definitely someone that the Prince Ding mansion had to monitor, whether it was his personality or his enmity with the Prince Ding mansion. If it wasn't for Ling Taihan's face and the friendship between Ling Taihan and Su Qingchen, Yili definitely wouldn't mind making the first move and killing this person. Send someone to keep an eye on him and inform Ling Taihan. If he dares to do anything he shouldn't do in Li City, don't blame me for not giving face to the head of the Yanwang chamber. Zhuojing acknowledged and retreated. Yili frowned as she thought about it. It had been more than half a month since the blue sky flower was brought back from the Chu capital. Xin Yang and Dr. Lin had been studying it behind closed doors every day and she didn't know when they would receive it. Although she usually couldn't see anything wrong with Mo Xiuyao, Yili still understood that with such a poisonous poison and old injury in his body, Mo Xiuyao definitely wouldn't be comfortable. After thinking about it, Yili got up and walked towards the courtyard where Xin Yang and Dr. Lin were staying. As soon as she entered, she heard Xin Yang and Dr. Lin quarreling non-stop. Xin Yang usually acted like a famous scholar. Even if his mouth was a bit poisonous, he rarely quarreled with others without any grace. Dr. Lin's personality was strange, but after interacting with him for a few months, Yili had never seen him like this. He was just about to roll up his sleeves and fight with someone. Stepping into the courtyard, Yili smiled and said, "Mr. Xin Master, what's wrong with the two of you?" Xin Yang snorted and raised his chin proudly. This genius doctor doesn't want to lower himself to the same level as a country bumpkin. Dr. Lin didn't hold back and looked at him with disdain. It's a country bumpkin who doesn't want to lower himself to your level. How dare you call yourself a genius doctor when you're so rigid? You've killed many people over the years, right? Xin Yang was furious. He jumped up and said angrily, "Old man Lin, don't take advantage of your seniority to think that I don't dare to beat you up. You actually dare to slander this old man's medical ethics." Dr. Lin sneered, "Do you think I'm afraid of you? Did the diarrhea yesterday feel good?" Yili couldn't help but cover her face and groan. As the saying goes, a mountain can't accommodate two tigers. This courtyard obviously couldn't accommodate two godly doctors. In the beginning, the two of them were chatting as if they wished they could have known each other earlier. How did they end up drugging each other in just a few months? She hurriedly held back the two men who were about to fight. "Mr. Xin, be gentlemanly. Master, don't be angry, don't be angry. We can talk this out." Dr. Lin snorted and squinted at Xin Yang. "For the sake of Princess Ding, this old man won't argue with you." Xin Yang snorted even louder than him. He waved his hand and smoothed his sleeves. Recovering his scholarly demeanor, he asked, "How does Wang Fei have the time to come here?" Yili was speechless. "If I didn't come, would you have killed each other?" In reality, Yili was worrying too much. In the recent days, the two of them had frequently disagreed. The servants in the courtyard were used to it. When they saw them quarrel, they would immediately hide far away to avoid being caught in the crossfire. Even so, they didn't see anyone kill the other. The three of them sat down. Xin Yang looked at Yili and said, "This old man understands why Wang Fei has come." Yili nodded with a faint smile and said, "Then Mr. Xin and Master must have made some progress?" Xin Yang and Dr. Lin looked at each other and then talked. The reason they quarreled every day was because they had made some progress. But the two of them couldn't agree and neither could convince the other. The ancient recipe for the Bailuo flower had been lost for almost 1,000 years and the recipe was extremely complicated. There were many places that were written that were wrong. If one place was wrong, the consequences would be unthinkable. Hearing Xin Yang's words, Yili was silent for a moment. She also understood that nothing could be solved so easily. Much less an ancient recipe that had been lost for thousands of years. But the Bailuo flower wasn't a medicinal ingredient that could be found anywhere and it wasn't allowed to be tested. "What is Mr. Xin and Master's opinion?" Hiding the disappointment that flashed through her heart, Yili asked. Xin Yang looked admiringly at Yili and said, "A more conservative method. Using the Bailuo flower as medicine can temporarily suppress the fire and cold poisons in the prince's body. It can guarantee the prince's safety for many years." Yili shook her head and rejected Xin Yang's method. Anyone with eyes could see that the future days wouldn't be peaceful. If something happened to Mo Xiao's body, then it would be better to let the Mahist army and the people of the Prince Ding mansion die. Also, where in the world could they find a second Bailuo flower? After thinking for a long time, Yili said, "The prince's body is fine for now. Please continue your research." In reality, The two of them also didn't think the conservative method was good, but they didn't dare to take Imo Xiuyao's life as a joke. Hearing Yi Li say this, they naturally agreed. Leaving Xin Yang's courtyard, Yi Li's mood was a bit gloomy. Strolling along the corridor, Yi Li suddenly stopped and said in a deep voice, "Qin Feng, go invite sickly scholar over. This consort wants to see him." Yes, this subordinate obeys. Sickly scholar's poison skills could be said to be unparalleled in the world, but his martial arts skills weren't as good because of his body. Since Qin Feng knew his specialties and weaknesses, it wasn't difficult for Qilin to invite him over as a guest. Third Pavilion Master, long time no see. How have you been? Yi Li led her people into the parlor and smiled as she looked at the young man sitting in the parlor with a sinister expression on his face. Sickly scholar heard this and turned around. He narrowed his eyes and stared at the quiet woman in green. His eyes flashed with a malicious light. Cough cough. Princess Ding? It has indeed been a long time. What? Imo Xiuyao isn't dead yet? Yi Li wasn't angry and smiled. Third Pavilion Master, thank you for your concern. The prince is fine. Otherwise, why would Pavilion Master go through so much trouble to come to Glass City from Xiling? Sickly scholar stared at her coldly and said, "The Bailuo flower is in your hands?" Back then, for the location of the Bailuo flower, he and Yi Li had a lot of battles of wits and courage. He didn't expect that in the end the item would fall into Yi Li's hands first. Yi Li lowered her eyes and said indifferently, "Imo Jingqi or Tan Jiji told you?" Sickly scholar raised his eyebrows. Yi Li smiled faintly. When Feng San came back from the capital, he told me that he was being chased by people from the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce. This consort guessed that it wouldn't be long before I meet Third Pavilion Master. However, Yi Li changed the topic and her calm eyes were tinged with a trace of coldness. Third Pavilion Master dared to come to my Glass City alone. Do you not care about this consort and the Prince Ding mansion, or do you think that this consort wouldn't dare to touch you because of Pavilion Master Ling? When Ling Taihan was mentioned, Sickly Scholar's expression turned ugly. He sneered, "This young master doesn't need you to care about Big Brother's face. Didn't Princess Ding invite this young master here to make a request of me? I heard that godly Dr. Shinyang lives in the Prince Ding mansion all year round. How is it? Has he figured out the prescription for the Bailuo flower?" Yi Li's lips curled into a faint smile as she nodded and admitted, "Third Pavilion Master is right. This consort did invite Third Pavilion Master here because of the Bailuo flower's prescription." Sickly Scholar's malicious face squeezed out a malicious smile. "Don't even think about it. You want me to save Imo Xiuyao? Stop dreaming. When this young master has mastered the Bailuo Huang Quan, I will invite Imo Xiuyao to have a taste." Chapter 478. Yi Li sat calmly on the chair and looked at him. Even her eyes did not move. Sickly Scholar looked strangely at Yi Li and asked, "You really are a strange woman. Are you really Imo Xiuyao's woman?" Yi Li raised an eyebrow and looked in puzzlement at him. Sickly Scholar examined Yi Li for a moment and then asked, "Without the ancient recipe for the blue jade falling flower, Imo Xiuyao would have died without a doubt. Are you not worried at all? Are you not angry at me for saying this?" I remember now. You also heard me say this in Nanjiang. At that time you did not show any traces. Even Imo Xiuyao himself is not as calm as you." Hearing this, Yi Li grimaced inside. How could she be calm? She was pretending that she had no choice but to be calm. In reality, she really wanted to teach the person in front of her a lesson right now. But she could not. Sickly Scholar examined Yi Li. After a while, he suddenly smiled and said, "I have it. If you really want to save Imo Xiuyao, it is not impossible. Follow me in the future. If you follow me, this master will be more generous and spare Imo Xiuyao's little life." Yi Li blinked and asked calmly, "Follow you? What does Third Pavilion Master want me to do with you?" Sickly Scholar looked at her with disdain and sneered, "You don't think that this master likes you, right? With your status, it's not bad for you to be a servant girl who serves tea for me. What do you think?" Standing behind Yi Li, Qin Feng's expression changed. He took a step forward and was about to attack. Yi Li raised a hand to stop him. She looked calmly at Sickly Scholar and said, "Third Pavilion Master, I have a bad habit. If I am not happy, I will make others even more unhappy than me. So, if my husband dies..." Sickly Scholar gave a disdainful smile and said, "Princess, you don't want to say that you want to kill my wife, right? I'm very sorry, this master has not married yet. Yili gave a faint smile and continued after being interrupted. I want other people's entire family to die. Not to mention your family, even if it is someone you know, this consort can kill them all. Shameless boasting. Sickly Scholar's eyes twitched as he said coldly. Did this woman think that the Yanwang Chamber was the #1 assassins organization in the world and that they did not even put the Emperor of Shiling's office in their eyes? Or did he think that he, the third pavilion master of the King of Hell's pavilion, was an inexperienced child who could achieve his goal with just a few words? Yili smiled and said, even if third pavilion master doubts my abilities, you shouldn't doubt the abilities of the Black Cloud Cavalry and the Qilin. Or is it that third pavilion master is determined to oppose the Prince Ding mansion for so many years, but you have not even figured out the strength of your opponent? This consort does not understand what kind of deep hatred there is between third pavilion master and our prince that you have to stake it all on one throw? Not to mention anything else, without the falling jade flower, with your distinguished self's current body, who knows when he will die? How will you take revenge? This consort sees that third pavilion master's complexion and body are much worse than when he was in Nanjiang, right? When the time comes, will it be our prince's poison or third pavilion master's illness that acts up first? Sickly Scholar's expression was twisted as he glared at Yili with a face full of resentment. His life had been full of misfortune since he was young, causing his personality to become twisted, and he would seek revenge for the smallest grievance. There was no deep hatred between him and Emo Xiao, but in this world he could be ranked in the top 3 of Emo Xiao's people. It was because Emo Xiao's palm had crippled most of his martial arts and damaged his heart meridians, causing his martial arts to stagnate and his body to become sickly. But in the end, it was because the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce had tried to assassinate Emo Xiao first. However, Sickly Scholar hated Emo Xiao from then on. Moreover, he hated him to the bone, and he would not rest until he was dead. It was as unreasonable as Han Mingyue falling in love with Su Zuidi. After a while, Sickly Scholar suddenly began to chuckle. After a while, he stopped laughing and raised his chin to look at Yili. Princess Ding, there is nothing you can say. Even if I die, I will drag Emo Xiao down with me. As for the ancient recipe for the falling jade flower, you don't have to worry about it. No one in this world can solve it. If you accidentally turn the life-saving antidote into a deadly poison, don't blame me for not warning you. Yili quietly looked at him for a while, then slowly smiled. In that case, third pavilion master can stay in the Prince Ding mansion for the time being. Why don't you see who will live longer, Prince or you? Even if there is no antidote, as long as Prince is alive, he will be able to call the wind and summon the rain. As for you, you will have to lie in bed for half a year. Other than playing with some useless poisons, you are just a useless piece of trash hiding under Pavilion Masterling's protection. Yili's voice was soft and slow. Even her face had a gentle and refined smile. However, the words that came out of her mouth were like sharp blades that stabbed into Sickly Scholar's heart without hesitation. Sickly Scholar's eyes suddenly widened. He stared at Yili with an indescribably terrifying expression. He suddenly stood up and threw himself at Yili. Bitch. You're speaking nonsense. However, he didn't even have the chance to touch Yili. A fierce palm wind knocked him out and threw him into a chair to the side. Before he could recover, a cold and harsh voice came from the door. Sickly Scholar. I think you don't want to be Sickly Scholar, you want to be a dead scholar. The tall man who appeared at the door was dressed in a purple brocade robe with cloud patterns. His white hair was casually tied up. He unconsciously exuded an aura and majesty that surpassed all living beings. Who else could it be but Emo Xiao? Sickly Scholar was sent flying into a chair by this sudden attack. He immediately spat out a mouthful of blood. It was clear that his injuries were not light. However, everyone present knew that Emo Xiao had definitely held back. Otherwise, with Emo Xiao's strength that could cripple most of Sickly Scholar's martial arts and almost break his heart, there was no way that Sickly Scholar would still be breathing after this attack. Emo Xiao stepped into the reception pavilion with a murderous aura. His eyes seemed to freeze over as he stared at Sickly Scholar. Emo Xiao was filled with killing intent towards Sickly Scholar. Sickly Scholar didn't feel the slightest bit of gratitude towards Emo Xiao's mercy. He propped himself up and glared at Emo Xiao with eyes that were about to pop out of their sockets. His gaze was so venomous that it seemed like he couldn't wait to tear the person in front of him to shreds. Although Yili couldn't understand, she couldn't help but admit that there were such people in this world. Even if you accidentally offended them a little, they would hate you so much that they wanted to exterminate your entire family. Sickly Scholar was clearly such a person. Thinking of this, Yili couldn't help but frown slightly. Only Sickly Scholar knew the complete prescription for the falling jade flower. If he really wanted Emo Xiao to die, even if it meant that he would rather die together with Emo Xiao, then things wouldn't be easy to handle. Emo Xiao sat down beside Yili. Looking at Yili's frowning appearance, he reached out and lifted her chin to face him. His hand lightly stroked her willowy eyebrows as he said softly, "Don't worry." Knowing that Emo Xiao didn't want her to worry, Yili smiled slightly and nodded. The warmth and harmony between the two of them pierced Sickly Scholar's eyes. He laughed coldly and said in a shrill voice, "Emo Xiao, your body won't be able to hold on for more than a few months, right? I think it's better if you let your woman worry a little more. Cough cough. When you die, their lives won't be easy." Chapter 479. Third Brother, Shut Up. Before Emo Xiao could fly into a rage, a tall and straight voice came from the door, walking in with a majestic gait. It was the great pavilion lord of the Yanwang Chamber, one of the four great experts, Ling Taihan, whom Yili had met once in Nanjiang. Although Sickly Scholar was arrogant and unruly, he was extremely respectful towards this sworn brother of his. If it was anyone else who had been told to shut up, they would have probably thrown a handful of poisonous sand at him. However, because the person who had come was Ling Taihan, Sickly Scholar obediently swallowed his words even though his expression was gloomy. Ling Taihan first nodded towards Emo Xiao and Yili before walking over to Sickly Scholar's side and taking his pulse. After discovering that the injury wasn't serious, he let out a sigh of relief and cupped his hands towards Emo Xiao. Many thanks to Prince Ding for being lenient. Yili sat beside Emo Xiao and carefully observed this world-famous Yanwang Chamber Lord. Last time in Nanjiang, time was tight and the two of them only exchanged a few words. They didn't have time to observe each other. Ling Taihan was only 35 or 36 years old this year. Because of his exquisite internal strength, he didn't seem to have reached the age of 30. However, his bearing was calm and his actions inadvertently revealed a heroic aura that made people understand that he was indeed a mature middle-aged man. At this point, it could be said that Yili had seen the four great experts of the world. Without mentioning the oldest Genom of Gojoseon, in Yili's opinion, Genom of Gojoseon was more like a politician and general than a peerless expert. Perhaps it was because of this state of mind that Genom of Gojoseon's martial arts cultivation had been stagnant all these years. Therefore, even though he was older than Emo Xiao and the others by a generation, he was still as famous as them. As for the other expert, Mu Qingsong, his age seemed to be about the same as Ling Taihan's. However, Mu Qingsong was trained to be more like a silent killing machine. He hid in the darkness where no one could see him and consumed his life year after year. Therefore, even though Mu Qingsong's age might not be as old as Ling Taihan, he seemed especially pale and powerless. If the two of them stood together, it would be hard to believe that they were both high-spirited and arrogant in the Jianghu. Of the four great experts, the one that Yili was most familiar with was naturally Emo Xiao. Even now, Yili was not sure how high Emo Xiao's martial arts were. However, his reputation as a heavenly genius was undeniable. Emo Xiaowen, Emo Xiao's elder brother, was a scholarly general. Although Emo Lufang was both a scholar and a martial artist, he was only at the level of an ordinary expert. The reason why he was able to beat Genom of Gojoseon to the point that he could not retaliate was because he relied on strategizing and strategizing. Yili even suspected that Genom of Gojoseon's martial arts was so high that he was preparing to assassinate Emo Lufang. However, Emo Xiao was an exception. When he obtained the title of one of the four great experts, he was only 14 years old. Although he was ranked last, everyone in the world knew that he had just started. Compared to Genom of Gojoseon at his peak, Ling Taihan and Mu Qingsong who were about to step into their peak, Emo Xiao could not even be considered to have just started. Such a heavenly genius. It was said that Ling Taihan once said in public that in at most 7 years, Emo Xiao would be unrivaled in the world. Unfortunately, the world was unpredictable. After Emo Xiao turned 18, his life began to strangely tilt and become silent. After comparing the four great experts, Yili felt that Ling Taihan was the true peerless expert in people's hearts. Steady, bold, and measured in his actions. He was more like the righteous Walin Alliance head of Jianghu and not the assassin leader of the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce who killed people like scything flax. Third brother's health is not good. Can I ask someone to find a doctor first? Ling Taihan glanced at his fierce and unruly adopted brother who could not speak due to his presence. He felt that leaving him here was not a good place to talk, so he asked Emo Shuyao. Emo Shuyao lowered his head and looked at Yi Li questioningly. Li Li was the one who invited him, so she naturally had the final say. Yi Li smiled and said, "Of course you can. There are 2 godly doctors in the Prince Ding mansion. If Pavilion Master Ling doesn't mind, you can send 3rd Pavilion Master over." Ling Taihan thanked her and shouted outside. Immediately 2 young men came in to await his orders. Ling Taihan said, "Take 3rd Pavilion Master to see a doctor. If he escapes, do as you see fit." The 2 young men's expressions were solemn. They naturally understood the Pavilion Master's intentions. The Yanwang Chamber of Commerce's punishments were not for show. Just as the 2 of them were about to ask Sickly Scholar to leave, Sickly Scholar's eyes flashed and he coldly said, "Scram." "Third brother." Ling Taihan's expression sank. He looked unhappily at Sickly Scholar's sallow and slightly pale face. Sickly Scholar also knew that his adopted brother was truly angry. However, he had just been hit by Emo Shuyao and was not lightly injured. Now that he was being suppressed by Ling Taihan, he was filled with anger and frustration that he had no way to vent. He was born with a leftist personality. After being suppressed by Ling Taihan, he did not even care about his older brother, whom he had respected since he was young. He sneered at Ling Taihan and roared, "You don't need to worry about my life or death. Didn't you dislike me for causing trouble? Wouldn't it be better if I died?" Hearing this, Ling Taihan's expression sank. Before he could react, a black shadow flew in from outside. Before the person could stand still, there was a pot sound and a heavy slap landed on Sickly Scholar's face. Sickly Scholar's arrogant glare towards Ling Taihan was immediately slapped to the side. "Impudent. Why haven't you apologized to your older brother yet?" The person's voice was clear but slightly cold. She was dressed in black and her slender figure appeared even more graceful. It was a beautiful woman in her 20s with a face as cold as ice. Yi Li slightly knit her brows. She had an idea of the woman's identity. Yanwang Chamber's 2nd Chamber Master Lung Luyue, who was known as Yu Luosha in the early years. Lung Luyue's qinggong and hidden weapons were unparalleled in the early years of Jianghu. To be able to charge into the palace alone, it seemed that her qinggong was not bad. She waved her hand and dismissed the guards who had followed Lung Luyue. After being slapped in the face in front of everyone, the expression on Sickly Scholar's face suddenly changed. The regret that had flashed across his face disappeared without a trace. He gritted his teeth and refused to look at Lung Luyue. Of course, he would not apologize to Ling Taihan. Ling Taihan did not care about this. He let out a sigh of relief at Lung Luyue's arrival and said, "Liyue, take Sandy to see a doctor. Don't let him run around." Lung Luyue nodded. She turned to Emo Shuyao and Yi Li and said, "I was anxious, please forgive me." Yi Li smiled faintly and said, "2nd Chamber Master's qinggong is extraordinary, this Fei admires it. But in the future, if Chamber Master comes again, it is better to go through the front door. The arrows of the Prince Ding mansion will not always leave the bow." Lung Luyue was stunned. She looked at the smiling Yi Li and nodded her head saying, "Thank you for the reminder." Then she turned to Sickly Scholar and said, "Come with me." Sickly Scholar's personality was strange, but he had some feelings for his 2 sworn brothers and sisters. Previously he had argued with Ling Taihan in a fit of anger. Now that he had been slapped, he slowly calmed down. Glancing at Yi Li and Emo Shuyao who were watching the show, he silently followed Lung Luyue. Although Yi Li did not show it on the surface, she was actually quite angry at Sickly Scholar. If it was not for the fact that Sickly Scholar had the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce and Ling Taihan behind him, Yi Li really would have tortured him. At this time, seeing his obedient appearance after being slapped, she felt very happy. She secretly cheered for Lung Luyue's slap. Good slap. Chapter 480. Without Sickly Scholar ruining the mood, the atmosphere in the parlor immediately became much better. Ling Taihan looked apologetically at Yi Li and Emo Shuyao and cupped his hands. "Third brother is ignorant and has offended you. I hope you can forgive him." "Pavilion Master, there's no need to worry. The reason we're keeping your younger brother alive isn't entirely because of Pavilion Master Ling's face, Yi Li said with a smile. Ling Taihan naturally understood Yi Li's pride. Of course they had to give face to the Yanwang chamber, but the Prince Ding mansion definitely wouldn't be afraid of the Yanwang chamber. The most important thing was that sickly scholar had the complete ancient recipe for the falling sky flower. Ling Taihan smiled bitterly and helplessly. To be honest, this humble one came to the northwest for this matter as well. If sickly scholar could obtain information about the falling sky flower from the Prince Ding mansion, then of course Ling Taihan could obtain it as well. However, Ling Taihan was different from sickly scholar. He didn't hate Emo Xiuyao and had no enmity with Emo Xiuyao, nor did he have any interest in Emo Xiuyao. Whether Emo Xiuyao lived or died didn't affect him in the slightest. If Emo Xiuyao really did die at an untimely age, then perhaps he would sigh and say that the heavens were jealous of geniuses. Since both sides needed the falling sky flower to save their lives, and the Prince Ding mansion had the medicinal ingredients, and the Yanwang chamber had the ancient recipe, why not take a step back and achieve a win-win situation? Compared to his adopted brother's life and health, his adopted brother's inexplicable hatred was even more insignificant in Ling Taihan's eyes. Yi Li raised her eyebrows and asked, "Does Pavilion Master Ling have the recipe as well?" Ling Taihan shook his head frankly and said seriously, "Princess Ding, please do not worry. I will definitely hand over the recipe. After all, this concerns not only Prince Ding's safety, but also my third brother's life. If Prince Ding really died, even if his third brother did not die of illness, the Prince Ding mansion would not let him go." Yi Li looked at him with a smile and asked suspiciously, "There's only one Biluo flower. Pavilion Master Ling, have you never thought about what to do if you don't have enough medicine?" Ling Taihan smiled and said, "This one doesn't know much about medicine or poison, but since third brother intends to use half of the Biluo flower to concoct medicine and half to concoct poison, it shouldn't be insufficient. Furthermore, I don't necessarily need the falling jade flower. I just hope that third brother's health will improve. Since he was young he has suffered more than others, so his temperament is a bit strange. Ever since he was injured he has become more and more withdrawn. It's all thanks to my guidance as his older brother. I hope the two of you can be magnanimous enough to forgive him." Sickly scholar's problem was not as absolute as Emo Xiuyao's poison. His body was the result of serious injuries. Although the falling jade flower was the best solution, it was not necessarily the only way to save him. With the Prince Ding mansion's ability, what kind of medicine could they not find and what kind of famous doctor could they not invite? Ling Taihan had wanted to personally go to the Prince Ding mansion to ask sickly scholar to treat him. However, sickly scholar vehemently opposed it and even ran away from home, so he could only give up. Yi Li naturally understood Ling Taihan's meaning. She couldn't help but have a better impression of this top assassin in Jianghu. Regardless of what Ling Taihan and the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce were doing, at least Ling Taihan treated sickly scholar really well, even though he was not related to him by blood. With sickly scholar's personality he was definitely not someone that people liked. It was not easy for Ling Taihan to be so considerate towards him. Also, with sickly scholar's personality and vicious methods, if it wasn't for Ling Taihan suppressing him, he would have caused a lot of trouble in Jianghu. Even if the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce was powerful, Jianghu was filled with crouching tigers and hidden dragons. Who knew when sickly scholar would provoke someone that he could not afford to provoke? Pavilion Master Ling is truly a good older brother. In that case, Pavilion Master, Second Pavilion Master and Third Pavilion Master should stay in Glass City for a while. As for the ancient recipe, there's no need to rush it. It's not that I don't trust Pavilion Master, but it's too important right now. It's better if Third Pavilion Master is willing to take it out. Yi Li nodded towards Ling Taihan as she spoke. Ling Taihan thought for a moment, then nodded in agreement to Yi Li's suggestion. He also understood why Yi Li had such concerns. It was because his third brother's personality was too extreme. Even if he stepped in, his sworn brother might not be able to change his mind. He might risk his life to perish together with Prince Ding. At that time, not only would Prince Ding and his third brother's lives be sacrificed, but the lives of everyone in the Prince Ding mansion and the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce would also be lost. Ling Taihan also knew a bit about Emo Xiuyao's situation. Seeing that Yi Li was still so calm at this time, he couldn't help but look at her in a new light. Then I'll have to trouble Princess Consort. After talking about sickly scholar's matter and Ling Taihan's departure, Yili got up and left the room for Mo Xiuyao and Ling Taihan to talk. She then got up and went to Xinyang's courtyard. Although the appearance of the Yanwang Chamber's second pavilion master had only been a fleeting one, Yili suddenly felt a trace of curiosity and interest towards this cold woman. Only Mo Xiuyao and Ling Taihan were left in the reception pavilion. It instantly became quiet. The two men both had extraordinary auras. Mo Xiuyao had more of the noble and domineering aura of someone born in a noble family, while Ling Taihan had more of the carefree and heroic aura of someone from the Jianghu. In terms of appearance, Ling Taihan lost to Mo Xiuyao by a bit. However, Ling Taihan's steady, heroic and carefree personality made it easier for people to get close to him than Mo Xiuyao. After quietly drinking tea for a while, Ling Taihan finally raised his teacup to Mo Xiuyao and said with a smile, "I've long heard that Princess Ding is one of the most extraordinary women of her time. I've met you once in Nanjiang, but seeing you today, I know that you live up to your reputation. Prince Ding has married a good wife. It's truly a good fortune." Mo Xiuyao nodded without any trace of politeness. Of course Princess Li is a good wife. Pavilion Master Ling didn't come here just for sickly scholar, right? If that's the case, then there's no need. You and I have an agreement. As long as he doesn't really anger me, I won't touch him. Ling Taihan looked at him with a smile and asked suspiciously, "Why did I feel like Prince Ding wanted to kill him?" Mo Xiuyao snorted and said, "He wanted to hurt Princess Li. I'll let him live." As for how he would let him live, that was up to him. As long as he had one breath left, it was still considered letting him live. You and I both know that he can't hurt Princess Ding at all. Not to mention Princess Ding's skills, the guard standing behind Princess Ding wasn't someone to be trifled with either. Based on his third brother's skills that were equivalent to half a cripple without poison, wanting to harm Ding Wangfei was just wishful thinking. However, Ling Taihan didn't plan on arguing with Mo Xiuyao about this. If he wanted to avenge his beloved wife, it was Yanwang Chamber's fault. He couldn't stop him. Otherwise, if he angered Mo Xiuyao, it would only make things worse for his third brother. Letting out a sigh, Ling Taihan stopped thinking about his headache-inducing younger brother and said, "Didn't you ask me why I came to Glass City? Just now there was a business deal that came to Yanwang Chamber." Mo Xiuyao frowned. "It's related to the Prince Ding mansion?" Ling Taihan nodded and said, "That's right. Although Yanwang Chamber has already said that they won't accept any business related to the Prince Ding mansion, the other party didn't want to assassinate anyone from the Prince Ding mansion this time. Also, the price they offered was very tempting." Mo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows and looked at him with an indifferent expression. Yanwang Chamber was in the business of killing people. If they didn't kill people, why would they look for them? If it was something else, there would naturally be people who could do it better than them. Ling Taihan smiled and said, "I've already accepted it." Chapter 481. Mo Xiuyao looked at him calmly. Ling Taihan could only sigh helplessly. He said seriously, "Didn't you fight with Lei Jinting a few days ago? The other side wants me to fight with you again. If it weren't for the fact that they couldn't find Mu Qingtsong, they would have even asked him to fight with you." "Reason?" Mo Xiuyao asked. Ling Taihan shook his head and frowned. "I've thought about it a few times these past few days. When you and Lei Jinting fought, neither of you used your full strength. That's why you both managed to escape unscathed. If you and I really fought, it would have been a lose-lose situation. However, after more than 10 years, I'm still looking forward to sparring with Prince Ding again." More than 10 years ago, Ling Taihan was only a young man in his early 20s. He was in high spirits at that time. Although Genom of Gojoseon was famous, he was still much older than them. The only person in the world who could compare to him was Mu Qingtsong. Who knew that at that time the 14-year-old Mo Xiuyao, dressed in white, would appear on a horse with a sword? Who knew how many people were stunned by the sword competition that year? Although Ling Taihan didn't lose, Ling Taihan didn't think that he would win by a single move against a 14-year-old youth. The result was almost a draw. At that time, Ling Taihan and Mo Xiuyao agreed to fight again 5 years later. After that, he went into seclusion in the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce. Who knew that after 5 years, the first news he received was that his third brother had recklessly gone to find trouble with Mo Xiuyao. At the same time, he also learned that Mo Xiuyao was seriously injured and crippled. At that time, Ling Taihan's feelings were even more complicated than when he had sparred with Mo Xiuyao. It was as if you had worked hard for 5 years and thought you could finally kill your enemy, only to be told that your enemy had just killed you yesterday. You really want to fight? Emo Shuyao asked. Ling Taihan laughed and said, why not? Or is your body still not fully recovered? In that case, it wouldn't be too late to fight after the falling jade flower was refined. I just forgot to confirm the date of the duel with him. The only reason he accepted the challenge was because he wanted to spar with Emo Shuyao. Therefore the time and place would naturally be decided by him and Emo Shuyao. So many years had passed and the so-called 4 great masters of the world had gone about their own business. There was almost no chance for them to meet, and this made Ling Taihan feel depressed for a long time. He needed to spar with experts of the same level to improve his martial skills. And among them, Emo Shuyao was undoubtedly the best opponent. As for Genom of Gojoseon, after hearing about the duel between Emo Shuyao and Genom of Gojoseon, Ling Taihan had already lost interest in his martial arts. Genom of Gojoseon's martial arts were clearly still at the level of 10 years ago. If he used his full strength, Ling Taihan felt that he had at least an 80% chance of winning. As soon as he walked into Xin Yang's courtyard, he heard the sound of an intense argument. It didn't sound like the usual Xin Yang and Dr. Lin who would fight at the slightest disagreement. Instead it sounded like all sorts of vicious and contemptuous taunts. Even Yi Li, who was standing at the door, couldn't help but twitch her mouth when she heard it. They didn't even enter the room. The two who were like fire and water last time were now united against outsiders. Xin Yang sat to one side and leisurely sipped his tea, looking like a distinguished scholar. Dr. Lin was also drinking tea at the side, looking at the people in front of him with disdain. Xue Jing, who had brought Leng Luyue and sickly scholar over, could only persuade them. Sirs, it was Wang Fei who asked you to take a look at this person. Dr. Lin snorted softly and glanced at Xue Jing, saying, how come this old man doesn't remember saying that I will only listen to your Wang Fei's orders? She said to take a look, so I'll take a look? Xin Yang smiled and said, this one may be receiving a salary from the Prince Ding mansion, but, as a divine doctor with self-respect, this one will definitely not take a look at someone of the same profession. These words were clearly to Dr. Lin's liking. Dr. Lin nodded and said, speaking of which, this old man had a nickname in the Jianghu in the past. It was called seeing death but not saving. The meaning is, I won't save those who shouldn't die and I won't save those who should die. When Dr. Lin first exclaimed that he was going to bed, it was at least 30 years ago. He was older than everyone present. Naturally, they didn't care whether what he said was true or not. Instead, they clearly expressed their position. Sickly scholar kept coughing. It was unknown whether it was because he was angry or because his injuries were too serious. When he finally recovered, he pulled Leng Liyue and said, second sister, let's go. After saying this, his gaze swept over Xin Yang and Dr. Lin like it was dipped in poison. He was thinking that when he recovered he would come back and poison these two old farts to death. Xin Yang and Dr. Lin naturally saw his gaze and expression. However, if it was someone else, they might be afraid of sickly scholar's superb poison skills and the poison that was difficult to cure. However, these two people could be said to be the top doctors of their time. Unless the sickly scholar really had the ability to concoct a poison that had been lost since ancient times, there really weren't many poisons that could scare them. Leng Luyue was different from sickly scholar. She had also heard of Xin Yang's name. The Yanwang Chamber of Commerce was a place where all kinds of strange people gathered. Leng Luyue naturally understood that most of the people with abilities had strange temperaments. She faintly looked at sickly scholar and cupped her hands. Third brother was rude, please forgive the two doctors. Hearing Leng Liyue's words, Yili understood that it was most likely sickly scholar who provoked them first. After all, although Xin Yang and Dr. Lin quarreled every day, they had never had any disputes with unrelated people. It was impossible for them to make things difficult for someone who came to seek treatment for no reason. Moreover, it was someone she asked to come over. Seeing this, Yili was no longer in a hurry to mediate. She leaned against the wall and thought. Seeing that Emo Xiaoyao and Ling Taihan's friendship was not ordinary, sickly scholar probably couldn't kill him. She had to find a chance to teach him a lesson to vent her anger. Second sister, you don't have to beg these two damn old men. With their little ability they can't even come up with a prescription. What ability do they have to treat me? Sickly scholar said disdainfully. Shut up. Leng Liyue frowned and snapped. One more word and I'll have Big Brother lock you up in the forbidden area and never come out again. Sickly scholar was startled. Looking at the beautiful and cold woman in black in front of him, a trace of sadness flashed in his eyes. On the other side, Dr. Lin chuckled and said to Sickly Scholar, "You speak as if you were the one who came up with that prescription." The ancient prescription that Xinyang knew of was basically just a legend. In his library, there was only half a prescription and it was a remnant from 1,000 years ago. Not only were the words different but the names of the herbs were also different. Even the meanings were written differently. Unless he had the complete ancient prescription, he really didn't believe that this strange kid in front of him could figure out the prescription himself. Sickly Scholar smiled coldly and kept silent. So what if he didn't come up with it himself? He was lucky enough to get the complete ancient prescription, so he won. If these people wanted to know the ancient prescription, wouldn't they have to beg him? "Mr. Shin Master, what's going on?" Seeing that the argument inside was about to end, Yili walked out and asked with a smile as she looked at the people in front of her. Zhuojing walked forward and told Yili what had happened. This Sickly Scholar was really asking for a beating. It was probably because he hadn't been able to vent his anger in the parlor earlier and had vented it on Xinyang and Dr. Lin. But which one of these two people was easy to get along with? Sickly Scholar almost spat out blood after hearing this. Xinyang smiled and didn't say anything. Dr. Lin wasn't so polite and snorted, "Where did you find such a vicious and sickly person? He's about to die and he still doesn't know his place." Yili raised her eyebrows slightly and looked at Sickly Scholar and Leng Luiyue. As long as she saw Sickly Scholar, he would always look sickly. So even after being hit by Mo Xiuyao, he still looked sickly and didn't look like he was about to die. It was Leng Luiyue who frowned and looked worriedly at her adopted brother. "My adopted brother doesn't know any better and has offended the two of you. I hope the two of you can save his life on account of his youth and ignorance." Chapter 482. Dr. Lin narrowed his eyes at Leng Luiyue and said, "You're more honest than that girl, but your brother, he's so mischievous. He clearly needs to be taught a lesson. It's better to kill him." Dr. Lin was still brooding over the fact that Yili had lied to him. Yili smiled bitterly in her heart. Leng Luiyue was a famous assassin in the pugilistic world. "Master, is there something wrong with your eyes?" Leng Luiyue's expression was solemn. Looking at Sickly Scholar's twisted expression, she said helplessly, "We siblings have relied on each other since we were young. My younger brother is insensible and as his elder sister I've taught him. Please forgive me." After saying that, Leng Luiyue bowed deeply to the two of them. Just as Leng Luiyue said, the three siblings had grown up together. When they first met, the oldest Ling Taihan was only 12, she was 9, and the youngest third brother was only 5. The three of them had no one to rely on as they wandered the pugilistic world. Later, the three of them were taken into the Yanwang chamber. In a place like the Yanwang chamber, only 2 or 3 out of 10 children could survive. It was also Ling Taihan who protected the two of them. Among them, third brother's martial arts aptitude was the worst. In order to let this little brother survive such a cruel training, she and big brother had put in a lot of effort. But in a place that Leng Luiyue did not know, no one could understand how he grew up to have such a personality. However, no matter what, he had never done anything to betray his sworn brother and sister. In fact, he had always listened to the two of them whenever they talked. Just based on this, the two of them could not ignore him. Second sister. Sickly Scholar glared at Leng Luiyue, his face pale. Ever since the three of them took over the Yanwang chamber, his second sister had never been so submissive to anyone. But now it was all because of him. It was as if he was an insensible little brother who would never grow up. Master Shin Master. Pavilion Master Ling and Prince can be considered old acquaintances. I hope that the two of you can make an exception, Yili said softly. Xinyang faintly glanced at Yili and said with a faint smile, "Elder Lin isn't wrong. If this brat continued to torment himself, even the emerald falling flower wouldn't be able to save his life. Did he really think that the falling jade flower was an immortal medicine? Did he really think that as long as he had half a breath left he would still be alive and kicking? Wang Fei, don't even think about the prescription in his hands. I think he clearly doesn't want to live anymore. Maybe he wants to die together with the prince." Hearing this, Sickly Scholar's expression changed slightly. His face was ashen and he didn't say anything. Yili saw this and was secretly surprised. Could it be that Mo Xiuyao and Sickly Scholar really had some deep-seated hatred? The curvy handwriting of the founder of the country was very good.